honestly, then you can expect to earn 51% of the rewards. On the other hand, if you go ahead and do a double spend, okay, then it's likely to sort of undermine faith in the currency, to cause a sustained drop in the dollar value of Bitcoin, and that might end up meaning that your future rewards are actually worth less. Okay, so that's the original argument, and then today there's a sort of more modern spin on that, because nowadays to participate meaningfully in mining, you have to use ASICs, right? So we have this software which is dedicated, it's very efficient at calculating the SHA-256 hash function. It's basically not good for anything else. So now the argument goes, okay, if you have 51% of the hash rate, then you must be heavily invested in ASICs. And now, if you carry out a double spend, then it's an option the community has to carry out some hard fork, swap out the hash function for another, okay, and then all your ASICs will be worthless. Yeah, and the idea, well, the hope is that this is enough to disincentivize the adversary from carrying out the attack. Okay, and maybe the second argument there is a little bit more robust because it doesn't require this drop in the price of the currency. But both of these arguments have this sort of troubling aspect to them that they require a sort of scorched earth approach to punishment, right? So in the first narrative, it's true that the attacker is punished, right? But it's also true that all the innocent holders of Bitcoin are punished as well. If the value of Bitcoin drops, they will lose out as well. Again, in the second narrative, again, it's true that the attacker is punished, right? They lose their ASICs, but so do all the honest miners, right? Their ASICs are also worthless. Okay, so the question arises, okay, so are these issues fundamental to permissionless consensus? Is this sort of scorched earth approach to punishment the best we can do? Or are these issues specific to Bitcoin's design decisions? Maybe in particular the fact that it's a proof of work protocol. Okay, so if we're not going to use proof of work, then the next most obvious alternative is proof of stake. Okay, when people first started talking about using proof of stake, back in around about 2011 or so, the original motivation wasn't that, to enact targeted punishment. The original motivation is just to provide an alternative method of Sybil resistance, one which is maybe less energy inefficient. But by around about 2014 or so, people were beginning to analyze this idea that stake might be useful in enacting targeted punishment. And at a high level, the intuition here is fairly sort of clear. So a fundamental difference between stake and using proof of stake and proof of work is, of course, that stake is controlled by the protocol, right? Stake is on-chain rather than off-chain. So with proof of work, it's kind of hard to imagine how the protocol can reach out and confiscate some people's ASICs and not others and so on. But with stake, this is kind of easy to imagine, right? So the hope is that in the context of a proof of stake protocol, maybe in the event of a double spend, the protocol might be able to surgically confiscate or slash, if you like, the stake of an attacker, leaving the honest participants unharmed. Okay, so at a high level, this seems sort of appealing, and maybe it's a sort of plausible idea. But if you actually sit down and try and write down a protocol that carries out this sort of targeted slashing, then you quickly realize there are sort of a number of different challenges here. So first of all, if you're going to enact targeted punishment, then you better know who the target is. So it seems here that the protocol should produce, in the event of a consistency violation, the protocol better produce proofs of guilt, pointing to those guilty parties. Okay? So this relates nicely to the recent work on accountability. Not just that, though. So the protocol better produce these proofs of guilt. It also better be the case that honest players receive those proofs of guilt quite quickly, right? Specifically, they better receive those before the adversary can cash out of their position, and it's too late to punish them anyway. Okay? And not just that, we also require that honest players have to reach consensus on who should be punished and where we should go on from there. And this is potentially difficult because the whole time here we're in a regime, so reaching consensus might sound like it should normally be easy, but don't forget we're in a regime here where the adversary is large enough to cause a consistency violation. Okay, so all of this is potentially more difficult than it might be. Okay, so Ethereum obviously wasn't the first proof of stake protocol, but it's the largest proof of stake protocol today by market cap. And as everyone will know, so recently made the move over to proof of stake. Years before that, though, Vitalik Buterin was already emphasizing the fact that one of the principal motivations for the move to proof of stake is this idea that doing so might make 51% attacks extremely expensive. And if you look at the official Ethereum documentation today, it re-emphasizes this point, that one of the principal motivations for moving to proof of stake is this idea that proof of stake should offer greater crypto-economic security. Okay, so certainly in the Ethereum community, and I think probably well beyond that, there's this idea that proof of stake should provide greater crypto-economic security. Okay, so this raises various questions. So first of all, is proof of stake more economically secure than proof of work? Before we can answer that, though, we have to decide, okay, what even does that mean, right? If we're going to answer that question in a rigorous way, we need to write down a precise definition. Okay, so we want a precise definition of what it means to be economically secure. But we don't just want to write down a definition so we can go to individual protocols and decide, are they economically secure, are they not? We're also interested in exploring the space more generally, right? So we want to know, like, how economically secure can a protocol be? Right? Could there exist protocols more secure than today's Ethereum? Okay, and we're also interested in how our basic setup assumptions impact the answers to these questions. So if you're working in distributed computing, you're used to working sort of basic assumptions. So is message delivery reliable or not? So more formally, are we in a synchronous, partially synchronous, or asynchronous setting? And we're used to the fact that which of these assumptions we make will impact the answers to lots of our questions. Okay, so here, that will again be the case. And a particularly important consideration here will be what assumptions we make about the active participation of honest players. Okay, so yeah, I guess the first basic task of the paper is to write down a formal definition of economic security. And at a high level, these are the sort of two things we want. Okay, we require, first of all, that honest players should never lose resources, okay, as long as there isn't a drop in the price of the currency. And then we're also going to require that in the event of a consistency violation, okay, the attacker is guaranteed to lose resources. Okay. Okay, so you can write down a formal definition of this sort, and the acronym EAAC here just stands for expensive to attack in the absence of collapse. Okay, so expensive to attack in the absence of a collapse in the value of the currency. Yeah, so we can write down a formal definition of this sort. Actually, doing so is rather nuanced. There are lots of nuanced considerations there, so it's a little bit more complicated than you might think. So if you're into the details, then obviously I suggest you look at the paper, and the details are all there. For the purposes of this talk, though, it's fine just to sort of work with the high-level version of the definition I've given here. Okay, so once we have a precise definition, of course, then we can go about proving theorems. And I'm going to present 3 results in this talk. Okay, we're going to start off with 2 impossibility results, then we'll have 1 possibility result. Before we state results, though, it's important to recognize precisely what we're trying to achieve here. Okay, so it's important to observe that actually, if the adversary is sufficiently bounded that they can't cause consistency violations anyway, then protocols can be sort of trivially EAC, right? If they can't cause consistency violations, then there's nothing we need to do. So what's really interesting here, and the question we're really interested in, is, can we achieve protocols which are EAC beyond the security threshold? Okay, that's the case we're interested in. Okay, so as I said, we're going to state 3 results, 2 impossibility results, and then 1 possibility result. So here's our first impossibility result. So I'll just state it, and then I'll explain the terms. Okay. So in the dynamically available and synchronous setting, with a half-bounded attacker, no protocol is EAC. Okay, so let's explain the terms here. So first of all, the easy one. So by half-bounded, I guess mean the adversary controls like half of the resources, half of the stake, half of the hash rate, or whatever. Okay. And so the theorem holds also then for larger adversaries, obviously. The synchronous setting here, that's just a formal way of saying that communication is reliable. Okay, so formally, we have this known bound delta. Messages always arrive within time delta. Okay, and then the dynamically available setting, okay, I won't write down a precise definition here. Again, you can look at the paper for that. But at a high level, that basically just means that honest participants with resources are allowed to be inactive. Okay, so you should think of this as being the setting in which your typical longest chain protocol operates. If you think about Bitcoin, with Bitcoin, it's fine, right? If some of the honest miners switch off their ASICs for a while and go away, the protocol will carry on operating fine. As long as amongst those who are active, who do have their ASICs on, a majority are honest. Okay, so the basic idea is that with a dynamically available protocol, the protocol doesn't have to know how many people will be turning up and carrying out the protocol, as long as amongst those who are, we have an honest majority. Okay, and as I say, so you should think of this as being the setting in which your typical longest chain protocol operates. it's worth observing that sort of BFT-style protocols are generally not live in this setting. Okay, they require further assumptions, right? Because with a BFT-style protocol, normally we're working with quorum certificates. We need a certain number of signatures at any given point to make progress. Okay, so if a certain number of people, honest guys, aren't turning up, then we just kill liveness. Okay. Okay, so in the dynamically available setting, even if we're in the synchronous setting, which makes it easier for the protocol, and with a half-bound attacker, no protocol is EAC. Okay. And obviously, the half-bound here is tight because if the attacker is F-bound, if F less than a half, then we're in this sort of this easy regime where we can just stop consistency violations in the first place. Okay, so to picture what's going on here, we can sort of think of a line going from left to right, where we have 0-bounded attackers on the left and 1-bounded attack on the right. Okay, and what the theorem is really saying here is that in this setting, we only have sort of 2 regimes of interest, right? So if the attacker is row-bounded for row less than a half, then we're in the region where we can just stop consistency violations anyway. Okay, so there, so protocols can be sort of trivially EAC. But as soon as we get to the point where the adversary is large enough to cause a consistency violation when they own half the resources, okay, at that point, they're already large enough to stop the protocol being EAC. Okay, so now I'll just give a brief sort of sketch of the idea behind the proof. As I said, the actual sort of definition itself is more complicated than I've stated, and the actual proof will be more complicated. But I just want to give a sort of a high-level cartoon version of the proof to give the idea. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to, towards a contradiction, suppose we have such a protocol. Okay, we'll consider 2 sets of players, X and Y, and let's suppose that they have equal resources. Okay, so half the stake each, half the hash rate or whatever. Okay, and we'll suppose that the players in X are Byzantine and the players in Y are honest. Okay, so if the players in Y are honest, then we know how they're going to behave. They're just going to carry out the protocol as they're supposed to. So how will the players in X behave? What they're going to do is they're basically going to pretend like the players in Y aren't there. Okay, so they're just going to pretend they're not receiving messages from the players in Y, and they're not going to send the players in Y any messages either. And what they're going to do is basically just simulate a version of the execution in amongst themselves. Okay, now the point is that if they do that, because we're in the DA setting, like precisely because we're in the DA setting, both X and Y have to carry on and confirm transactions. Right? Why? Because as far as the players in Y are concerned, the players in X might be honest and might just not be active in carrying out the protocol. Right? That's allowed in the DA setting. Okay, so if we're going to satisfy liveness, the players in Y have to get on and confirm transactions. Similarly, the players in X will confirm transactions. And generally, these transactions will be conflicting. Okay, and then once the players in X see these conflicting transactions confirmed, okay, then what they do is to disseminate all messages from their simulation. And now the point is, if you're a late arriving player, then you can't distinguish which of X and Y are Byzantine, okay, by a basic sort of symmetry argument. So the protocol could make a sort of a guess, and they might get lucky and decide we're going to punish X in this circumstance. But if they do that, then it's a symmetric circumstance in which actually it was the players in Y who were Byzantine, and now you've punished the honest players. Okay, so we concluded this. Asymmetric punishment is not possible in that setting. Okay, so that's theorem 1. Okay, so that relates to the dynamically available setting. And basically it says that dynamically available protocols can't be non-trivially EAC. Okay, so you can think of that as being saying the longest chain protocols, or typical longest chain protocols, can't be EAC. Okay, so now moving on to theorem 2 then. Okay, so again, I'll state it first and then I'll explain the terms. So in the quasi-permissionless and partially synchronous setting, with a 3rd bounded attacker, no protocol is EAC. Okay, so it's, again, an impossibility result. Okay, so what do these terms here mean? So we know already that in a dynamically available setting, okay, there's nothing interesting we can do. You can't be EAC in an interesting way. So we have to make things easier for the protocol in some way. So what we're going to do, we're going to make things easier by moving from the dynamically available to the quasi-permissionless setting. And the basic difference between the dynamically available and quasi-permissionless settings is in the latter, in the quasi-permissionless setting, we can assume that honest players with resources are always active. Okay? And basically, this is what allows us to carry out things like your typical BFT-style protocol. Okay? Okay, so we've made things easier in one way, and then we're going to make things harder in another. So we're also going to move from the synchronous to the partially synchronous setting. Okay, so roughly speaking, being in the partially synchronous setting means that now a communication network may sometimes be unreliable. So more formally, so in the synchronous setting, you've got some known bound delta. Messages are always delivered within delta. In the partially synchronous setting, you again have a known bound delta, and now messages aren't always delivered within delta, but they are after some point in the execution, which we call global stabilization time, or GST. Okay, so if you move to the partially synchronous setting, then the Rel-off cutoff point moves from a half to a third now. Okay, so now it's possible to be live and consistent if the adversary is row bounded for row less than a third. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, so that's the statement of theorem. So the third bound is clearly tight there. Okay, so to picture what's going on here again, so we can again see things on this line going from left to right. So we have a zero-bounded attacker on the left, moving all the way to a ROM-bounded attacker on the right. And again, what the theorem is saying is that in this setting, we also have only two regimes of interest. Okay, so if the adversary is row-bounded for row less than a third, okay, then there's this regime where we can stop consistency violations anyway. Okay, so you just would be EAC in a trivial sense. But as soon as you get to this point where the adversary is actually large enough to cause a consistency violation, okay, then they're already large enough to stop the protocol being EAC. Okay, so now let's move on to the possibility result then. Okay. So far we've seen that if protocols are dynamically available, they can't be EAC. If we work in the quasi-permissionless setting, and if we're in partial synchrony, then they can't be EAC. So you should expect that to get a positive result, we're going to work in the quasi-permissionless and synchronous setting, and then things might be possible. Okay, and in fact, that's exactly what we're going to say. Actually, I'm going to state two versions of this theorem. Okay, first of all, I'm going to state a sort of an easy, simple version, which is easy to take away and understand, but which is kind of unsatisfying in some ways. And then I'll state a more interesting version of the theorem. Okay, so here's the first version. Okay, so there is an EAC protocol in the quasi-permissionless and synchronous setting with an F-bounded attacker for F less than 2/3. Okay, so here we've moved beyond the security threshold, beyond the security threshold of a half. So now we can have protocols that are non-trivially EAC. Okay, so that version, though, is kind of a little bit unsatisfying. Why? Because when we move to the quasi-permissionless setting, where we can carry out sort of BFT-style protocols, normally what we expect is that a benefit of that is that we get to work in partial synchrony. We have a protocol which is live and consistent in partial synchrony, and that's something that's valuable to us. We don't want to give that up. Okay, so now I want to state a more refined version of the theorem. Okay, so recall in synchrony, we have this known bound delta. Messages always arrive within delta. In partial synchrony, again, we have this known bound delta. Messages always arrive within delta after GST. Now what I want to do is to consider two different parameters. Okay, so we'll have a first parameter, delta 1, which you could think of as being very small. Okay, something of the order of a second or so. And then we'll have a second parameter, delta 2, which you could think of as being much larger. Okay, so maybe of the order of hours or even larger than that. Okay, and what we'll have is that for those two parameters, in the quasi-permissionless and partially synchronous setting, so partially synchronous with respect to delta 1, so messages always arrive within time delta 1 after GST. Okay, so first of all, so there is a protocol that gives you everything you would normally want, okay, in the partially synchronous setting for quasi-permissionless protocols. There's a protocol which is consistent and live as long as the adversary is F-bounded for F less than a third. Okay, that's the most you can expect. Okay, so we're getting everything we would normally want, and actually the latency here will be order delta 1. So after GST, we'll be finalizing transactions within the order of seconds. Okay, but then we're also going to give you something else extra for free, so some extra EAC guarantees for free. Okay, so the protocol will also be EAC for an F-bounded attacker as long as F is less than 2/3, and whenever all message delays pre-GST are at most delta 2, this large time bound of maybe an hour to a few hours or so. Okay. And actually, to make the statement of the theorem sort of simple, we're requiring here that all message delays pre-GST are at most arrive within delta 2. We don't really actually require that. All we really require is around the time of a consistency attack. That's true. Okay. Okay. So that's the statement of the theorem. And again, yeah, so 2/3 is the best possible here. Basically, that follows from a proof of Tessitor, which we can adapt to this setting. Okay, so again, to picture the result, what the theorem is saying is that there are now three regimes of interest. Okay, so if the adversary is row-bounded for row less than a third, okay, then we're in this sort of trivial regime where we can just stop consistency violations in the first place. Okay, so protocols can be sort of trivially EAC. Then if row is between a third and 2/3, Okay, and now we're in this new regime where now consistency violations are possible, but we can exact asymmetric punishment. Okay, the protocols can now be sort of non-trivially EAC. Okay, we do require some sort of bound on the adversary though, right? So if the adversary is larger than 2/3, now consistency violations are possible and we can't really do anything about it. Okay, so to finish off with, let me say a little bit about the proof. I'm not sure how much time I have though, so I'll have to try and go through it a bit quickly. So, so to prove the positive result, we describe a proof of stake protocol called POST. The starting point here is Tendermint. Okay, so Tendermint is a permission protocol though, so we have to make it into a sort of proof of stake version. So first of all, we do that in a fairly obvious sort of way. So we divide the execution into epochs, each task with finalizing some large number of blocks. Then we have the player set updated at each epoch according to new stake amounts. Okay, now let's go back to those sort of 3 different tasks which I described earlier on there. Okay, but what we said earlier on is that if we're going to enact targeted punishment, then the protocol better produce sort of proofs of guilt in the case of a consistency violation. This basically turns out to be pretty easy if you're using Tendermint. Tendermint basically gives that to you. Okay. We also said, though, that the protocol better provide the honest players with proofs of guilt quickly in the event of a consistency violation, right? Okay, basically before the adversary has time to cash out their position. And we'll see that this is potentially sort of problematic. So I'm going to call that now, I'm going to call that sort of challenge 1 in which we're going as we go forward. And we also said that, okay, honest players also, they better reach consensus on who should be slashed. And again, this may be problematic because don't forget, we're in a regime here where the adversary is large enough to cause a consistency violation. Okay, so they may be able to stop us reaching consensus. Okay, so challenge 1 there was the second point, right? So we have to make sure that honest players receive these proofs of guilt in a timely fashion. Actually, if you're using Tendermint with your sort of 2 stages of voting, that's problematic. Okay, basically, what the adversary can do is to create 2 different blocks, each with sort of stage 2 QCs, keep one in their pocket, and then just release it later on at the time of their choosing. Okay? But then luckily, the sort of simplest possible fix you could think of will work here if you do it properly. Okay, if we use 3 stages of voting, then we can avoid this problem. Basically, if you use 3 stages of voting, then the adversary can't cause stage 3 conflicts without honest players seeing stage 2 conflicts already. And that's using here again the fact the adversary is less than 2/3 bounded. It requires some sort of honest participation in order to form each QC. Okay, and then the last challenge is that we require honest players to reach consensus on who should be slashed. Okay. And it turns out here sort of things are sort of easier if f is less than 5/9. So if f is less than 5/9, then actually once you carry out your slashing, once you slash 1/3 of the stake, then the adversary will have less than 1/3 of the remaining stake. And that makes things easy for various reasons. If the adversary has more than 5/9, then things are more difficult, and there are various different approaches you can take here. One approach would be to employ, sort of flip into a mode where you employ the Dolev strong protocol just until you finalize slashing conditions. That works, but it's very inefficient. So I'm going to talk about how you can proceed more efficiently. Okay. So yeah, so if the adversary has more than 5/9 at stake, then you're potentially in a difficult scenario. And the solution here is that upon seeing your first proof of guilt, the players switch into a sort of recovery mode in which you redefine what you mean by a QC. Basically, in order to enforce liveness in this scenario, we require less signatures to form a QC. Okay? That allows us to enforce liveness. That in itself brings more complications because there's a trade-off between liveness and consistency here. The easier you make liveness, the easier you make it also to cause consistency violations. Okay, and so, yeah, things are a little bit complicated there, but we can deal with all that, and eventually we can prove that the recovery process will finalize with consensus on slashing conditions. Okay, so to sum up then, so we saw 3 different results. We saw 2 impossibility results, 1 possibility result. So I guess the sort of takeaway message from the first impossibility result, which is you cannot carry out slashing or any asymmetric punishment without strong assumptions on the active participation of honest stakers. Okay, in particular, you can't do it in a dynamically available setting. Okay, and the sort of basic takeaway from the second impossibility result is that you cannot carry out slashing or any asymmetric punishment without bounds on worst-case message delays. Okay, then with the third result, we saw that we can augment BFT-style protocols to carry out slashing and provably recover from any less than 2/3 bounded attacker. Okay, thanks very much for listening, and we'll stop there.
Thank you. We have time for some questions.
Hey, great talk, Andy. I'm wondering why you need the round 3 to force the adversary to reveal round 2 QC. Why does the second round not force the adversary to reveal the round 1?
Yeah, you have to think carefully about the timing of the way in which this happens. So if you look at the paper, there's a sort of, okay. So it's fine if the adversary produces an earlier block with a round with stage 2 QC and then a later block with a stage 1 QC. That's not problematic. The problem is when they produce a later block with a stage 2 QC and sort of later on reveal an earlier block which you only thought had a stage 1 QC, and then they show you have a stage 1 or 2 QC. And that in itself doesn't provide us a proof of guilt to anybody. So it's like the existing, okay. So adding 3 stages gets rid of that problem.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hey, like more of a higher level question. What has happened to the picture here if you do allow the honest nodes to be slashed, but just a bit, you know, in order to pay for slashing the adversary who did the consistency violation instead of not being slashed at all?
So you want to add in some sort of epsilon or allow epsilon slashing for honest. Okay, I haven't thought about that. If you want an immediate gut reaction, it doesn't sound that useful to me, but I may be wrong. I haven't thought about that process. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good. Any other questions from the floor? Maybe I have a last question. Your base case was the proof of work, where the mining equipment becomes worthless. What happens if we consider space-based protocols like Filecoin?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Basically, all the arguments here are entirely agnostic to the form of the resource. So I'm talking in terms of proof of stake and proof of work, and obviously the positive result is given in terms of proof of stake, but the negative results are agnostic to the form of the resources. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you again. Okay, while we're waiting, now she's here, for Ellie Davidson to talk about espresso, a fitting topic for after lunch, the espresso sequencing network. And the floor is yours, please.
All right, thank you. So yeah, this work is done by many people at Espresso, as well as Dalia Malki and Kartik Nayak. So I'm going to go over why we made this protocol to begin with, and then why we specifically designed it the way that we did. So to start off with, what is a shared sequencing network, and why do you need one in the first place? Well, let's look at things, how things are today on Ethereum. Let's say that we have rollups A, B, C, and D. Each one of these rollups has a sequencer. This sequencer takes in transactions for that rollup only, decides the order of them, and outputs them into some sort of a block. And then this block is sent to the layer 1, usually Ethereum, or a proof of the block is sent to the layer 1. So this seems really great. This gives us a lot of really good things. So this horizontally scales the layer 1, and we can also take advantage of the heterogeneous networks. So powerful nodes can be these roll-up sequencers, and weaker nodes can just verify the proofs. So this is great, but there's a problem. The problem is that each one of these rollups is very isolated, and they're very fragmented, and it's really difficult to do things between rollups today. So we want to improve upon that. So what you want is for one transaction to be able to update state across multiple rollups at once. And you also want to go further, and you want to say rollups should actually be able to pass messages between each other in a trustless way. And basically what we're trying to go for is this property called synchronous atomic composability. And so there's, atomic composability. It means that if you have multiple sides of a transaction, they're either all going to execute successfully, or none are going to execute at all. This is a really useful property because this can really de-risk a lot of operations. So a really good example of this is bridging. If a bridge operator can be guaranteed that both sides of the bridge transaction are going to either fail or succeed, they don't have to take nearly as much risk. And you can actually go even further and users themselves can mint and burn and do bridges themselves without even having to trust a bridge provider. So this is atomic composability. But then we want to take it one step further, and we're going to make it synchronous. So today, you can create atomic composability. Basically, you submit one side of the transaction, you wait for it to be final, then you submit the other side and wait for it to be final, and then maybe you have some smart contract that will like revert those transactions if necessary. But that takes a long time, and it's really not a great user experience. So we're going for synchronous atomic composability, which means that you can do this all at the same time. And so this sequencing layer is in yellow here, and this is what the Espresso sequencing network is. So the protocol that we have, that we've designed for this, is called Hotshot, and I'll explain how that works. But yeah, just to reiterate, we want to achieve synchronous atomic composability by sequencing transactions for multiple L2s at the same time. That's our goal. All right, so now I'm actually going to describe the protocol. So we have Hotshot, and it's made up of 3 major components. The first is the Hot Stuff 2 consensus protocol. Next, we have our Tiramisu 3-layer data availability protocol. And then finally, we have a nifty proposer-builder exchange protocol. But first, before we jump into that, let's talk about our threat model. So we have chosen a bribery-resistant threat model, or a bribing adversary threat model. And in this model, we assume that the adversary can passively bribe nodes. They do not need to actually control any keys of the nodes. They can just very passively offer bribes. And we're also going to assume that they have a finite budget, and that this budget is going to be less than 1/3 of the network stake for any given round. And so the reason that we chose this threat model is a bribing adversary is actually quite realistic in the blockchain space. And I think this will give some more clarification why. So the really cool things about a bribing adversary is that you cannot rely on small committees for safety. And so this really impacts the design that we chose. And the adversary does not actually have to know the identities of the people they're bribing in advance. And they also do not need to predict steps in the protocol. And the way that this would work is that an adversary can create a smart contract that says, hey, if you submit proof to me that you were malicious in this protocol, I'll pay you for it. And in this way, nodes are going to act rationally. If they will make enough money by doing this malicious behavior, they'll do so. And the passive adversary basically needs to do very little. So this is a very strong threat model that we have, but it's a fairly realistic one. So part 1. We're going to start with the Hot Stuff 2 protocol. This protocol is by Dalia Malki and Kartik Nayak. This is going to be the base layer for the protocol. So this protocol is kind of a standard 2-phase commit protocol. The leader sends the block to all the parties. All of the parties vote. They send their votes back to the leader. The leader collects a certificate, disseminates that certificate. Nodes vote again, and then finally, they can commit or finalize their data. And the really good thing about this protocol is that it has linear communication complexity. And this is important because we want to be able to scale to thousands of nodes. So a key part of our protocol is that we want it to be credibly neutral. Rollups and L2s are not going to want to share a sequencing layer if it's controlled by one particular rollup. So we want a credibly neutral network. And having many nodes can help with that. Having thousands of nodes can also help with decentralization, and it can give you stronger economic security. So we actually have designed our network to be able to scale to the same number of validators as Ethereum. That is the physical number of validators, so about on the order of 10,000 nodes. And then secondly, the good thing about Hot Stuff 2 is that it's optimistically responsive. We want low latency and high throughput, particularly because if we are going to be sequencing the transactions of all of these rollups at once, we need to be able to handle the throughput of all of those rollups at once. And then we definitely want low latency, because if we don't have low latency, then you might as well just use the L1. So yes. And then the final point is that we also want good throughput because there's a lot of growing data availability demands. Right now, rollups use Ethereum. They used to post their transaction data via call data. Now they can use blobs. But as more rollups get more traction, we see more rollups, there's there's going to be a greater need for space to store your transaction data, and maybe Ethereum is not the best place. And so another thing about why we chose this protocol is that remember that this is for L2s, and L2s eventually settle to Ethereum. So this protocol, it requires a fixed set of participants. It's a proof-of-stake protocol, and the participants can change every epoch. This is different than, say, the Ethereum protocol, which is designed to be more dynamically available, where anybody can join the network or leave at any time. And so the idea is we chose this hot stuff protocol because it complements the dynamic availability of the Ethereum protocol. So you can get the benefits of dynamic availability and the benefits of strong finality at the same time. So the obvious question is, well, why not stop there? This seems like a perfectly fine sequencing network, and that's true. This can give you good latency, good throughput. It can scale to lots of nodes. Perfect. Well, but we can actually do a little bit better. And so that's what we're going to do. Observation is that a sequencer, it just sequences transactions. It does not need to execute those transactions, and it, in fact, doesn't need to know anything about the transactions. They are just sequencing blobs of data. So because of this, we can relax the constraints, and we can say that instead of every node in the network needing to execute the transaction, instead, the data just needs to be recoverable at some later point when the transaction needs to be executed. So this is the data availability property that we want. And of course, we can use this in our protocol. All right, so this goes to part 2, which is our 3-layer data availability protocol. So we're going to start with the first layer. The first layer is based off of a verifiable information dispersal scheme. It's very similar to the Avid1 scheme. And the way that this scheme works is that the leader, instead of sending the full block data out to everybody, they're instead just going to send a little chunk or a share of the data. This share is actually an erasure encoded share where you only need F+1 valid shares to recover the full block. And then each node also receives a provable commitment to the block. And this is to verify that the share actually does match the block that everybody else is getting. So this is really good because if you're erasure coding shares, the size of the data sent to each node in the network is actually inversely correlated to network size. So as the network grows, each individual node needs to receive less data. This is really good for when we want to scale to so many nodes. And then finally, the provable commitment is this gets sent to all nodes, true, but it's very small and it's constant size, so it does not, the size of the network does not impact the size. And this is great because now we're sending less data through the network and we can get better latency and better throughput. All right, so this seems pretty good. Let me describe how it works in the protocol. So we have our standard kind of hot stuff 2 protocol. And nodes, we're now going to add an extra step, although this step is done at the same time in parallel with the protocol. So honest nodes are only going to vote if they receive a valid VID share that matches the proposal's block commitment. So when you get a quorum certificate, you're not only certifying a block proposal, but you're also certifying that the data is recoverable in the future. And this is, our adversary can't attack this because we assume that the adversary does not have greater than 1/3 of the stake. So this seems really good, but it's slow. So actually sequencing data is very fast with this protocol, but at some point you need to recover it and actually execute it. And to do that, that's a little, it's not very optimal. You have to reach out to all of these nodes, collect all of their shares, and then reconstruct the data. So this is not ideal, so we're going to add on a second layer, which is the middle layer. And we're going to add a data availability committee. This is a small committee that actually does receive the full block data. And this committee can be quite small, so you may think if we have a 1,000 node network, this committee may be only 10 nodes out of the network. And this small committee is going to host the block for fast recoverability. And so we're going to add one more extra step to the protocol, but this again happens in parallel with the other steps. Honest nodes will only vote if they see a data availability certificate, which it means a quorum of the data availability committee acknowledges that they received the full block and their VID share. So we're adding one extra check for nodes to vote for a block proposal. So yeah, this is just the DA vote. The DA committee members also send this vote saying that they've got their block. But if you recall, we'll go back to our threat model, and I specifically said you cannot rely on small committees for safety. And this is still true. And we're not actually using this committee for safety. And it definitely is possible that an adversary could bribe this committee. And I'll kind of go into that in a few minutes about what that would look like. But for now, the data availability committees, they're used for the optimistic path. So they're not used for security. They're just used to optimistically get the data out to nodes faster. And you may notice that, well, okay, an adversary can bribe this DA committee, and then they can force the protocol into this slow recoverability path. And I'm going to comment on that in a moment. But first, we're going to go on to the top layer. And the top layer is a CDN, which hosts the full block data, and you can just shove data out to all of the nodes. It's a very, very high bandwidth CDN, and it can get data out really quickly. The CDN is not a member of the network. They are not staked in the network, and they are also not trusted in the network. And so in this case, along with sending the VID shares to all of the nodes, the node is also going to send the full block to the CDN. And with this, then it makes it extremely easy for anyone to recover it who needs it. This also is very good for large networks. So when you have like a network that's like 10, 100 nodes, generally a direct point-to-point connection between all of the nodes is going to give you the best performance. But that does not scale to 10,000s of nodes. So this allows us to have really good throughput while still being able to have a network with thousands of nodes. But obviously, we do not want to trust the CDN, so a peer-to-peer gossip layer does run in the background. But this layer, instead of double sending all of the data, it just sends commitments to data, and then if a node realizes that they don't have certain data, they can request it from one of their peers. So we still get censorship resistance, but we also get really good network performance. But, of course, the adversary could also bribe this CDN as well. So to recap, most nodes do not need to receive all data, and this improves our throughput a lot. Some nodes, a small committee, will host the full data for quick recoverability, and the protocol is secure against our bribing adversary. And I'll make a quick comment about how this scheme compares to data availability sampling from Ethereum. This scheme, VID and data availability sampling, they are not mutually exclusive. You can combine them together. The reason we chose this protocol is for a few reasons. You can do a couple of options with data availability sampling. The first one is when nodes receive a block proposal, they need to reach out to several other nodes to prove that that block is available. And this is a probabilistic proof of availability. That adds extra latency to your protocol, though. The second option is that you can say, okay, we'll finalize the block without reaching out to the data, or data without sampling the block, but then you run the risk of finalizing block data that actually can never be recovered in the future, and that breaks the safety of your protocol. So data availability sampling can be very useful, and it can actually work alongside this, but specifically, we want to reduce the latency in the protocol, and we also want to make sure that at finalization time, the data is recoverable, and there's no case in the future where it's not. All right, but going back to the adversary, I said earlier, well, the adversary can force the protocol into these pessimistic conditions, and that's not great. No, it's not. But I'm going to argue that it's actually not a very useful attack for the adversary to do. So note that the adversary can only make it slow to recover the block data. The blocks are still being sequenced just as fast. And the adversary can't attack forever. They have a finite budget. So the worst that the adversary can do is delay execution for some rollups, maybe for a short time. But the execution isn't as important because it's the sequence of transactions that determines that execution, and that keeps, and blocks keep getting sequenced just as fast. So there's really not much incentive to attack. There's really not a whole lot of monetary gain you can get by slowing down execution. So yes, an adversary could bribe the DA committee and the CDN, but there's not much incentive to do so. And then so finally, just to kind of recap this 3-layer approach, we have VID shares. And so when you finalize a block in our protocol, it's saying that the block can be recovered by F+1 shares. It's also saying that a small DA committee has attested that they have the full block. And then it's just doing the normal thing of it saying that this block is safe to extend the chain. And you have the CDN there to help data flow through the network. All right, but finally, we're now going to go on to builders. So in Ethereum today, as many of you know, proposer-builder separation is very integral in the protocol. It began as this out-of-Ethereum protocol thing, and now there's a lot of ideas to try to enshrine it into the protocol. So when we were developing this protocol, we wanted to think, is that something that we would want to do? And the answer is yes, and I'll describe how we do it. So builders and proposers have different incentives, and this is essentially a fair exchange problem. The builder only wants to reveal their block after they know it's definitely going to be included in the chain, because otherwise the proposer could steal their block data. And then proposers, though, they want to make sure that if they're paying, or they want to make sure that they're going to be paid even if a builder decides to go offline. So what we're going to propose here is a proposer-builder exchange protocol, and it's incentive compatible, so it solves the fair exchange problem for the majority of cases. So let's see how it works. So we're going to add this blue dot, and that dot is the builder. Step one, or sorry, the current state in Ethereum today is that you have a trusted third party. Well, we don't really want that. So the first step in the protocol is that the proposer is going to delegate their proposing rights to the builder. They are going to sign a commitment for the builder plus a fee that the builder is going to pay them. Next, instead of the leader sending out the block proposal and the block data, the builder is going to send it out. However, the builder is going to encrypt the block and is going to send a share of the decryption key to each one of the nodes in the network along with their VID share. And then when it comes time to collect the votes and form a quorum certificate, instead of the leader, it's actually going to be the builder that forms the certificate and sends it out to all nodes. And what this is going to do is that nodes are now going to lock on the builder's block. So if the builder successfully sends the certificate that it created to at least F+1 on its nodes, these nodes are going to lock on it. And this means that a future proposer must build off this locked block. And then finally, the builder is also going to disseminate some key to decrypt the block to the DA committee and the CDN, so we don't go back to this problem where you have to contact a bunch of people for their shares. So this is the protocol. But and the next proposer must build off of this block. So let's look at some things that could go wrong. So let's say that a builder, they just decide to go offline, and they don't actually disseminate the certificate, and they don't reveal the encryption key, or the decryption key. So the builder doesn't really have incentive to do this. The builder will lose reputation. They'll lose block revenue because the block is now not being committed, so they'll lose any of that. And that's not good, so a builder is not incentivized to do this. But the downside is that the proposer won't get paid because the block is not being finalized on chain. The other attack is that a proposer might try to steal the builder's data by causing a reorg. So in this case, the third leader may try to build off a block that is older, and in their new block proposal, they're going to include the builder's data. But this doesn't work, because if you have F+1 nodes that are locked on the builder's data, they are never going to vote for a proposal that builds off of something else. And so if the proposer wants to actually get something committed on chain, they have to respect the locked block. So in this way, go back one slide. So in this way, the builder is essentially delegated the proposer rights, and they are acting as a proposer in the protocol. And since they're the ones that are collecting votes and disseminating the certificate, they feel comfortable finally decrypting their data because they know that the block is eventually going to be finalized on chain. And then just as a quick side note, this can actually work with multiple builders. So if we're building a sequencing network for all of these rollups, there might be hundreds or more roll-ups that we're sequencing for. And it probably doesn't make sense that one builder is building for all of those. So we might try to do something like run a lottery or an auction where we can say, hey, this builder is going to build for these 5 roll-ups, this other builder is going to build for these 5 roll-ups. And this protocol also works under that design as well. All right, so to recap, we have the Espresso sequencing network, and we've designed our hotshot consensus protocol to support this. Our goal is that we want to build a very performant but secure shared sequencing network that helps L2 fragmentation and gives us this really good property of atomic composability. And how do we do this? Well, we base our protocol off of Hot Stuff 2. It's optimistically responsive, and it has linear communication complexity, which gives us a high throughput and low latency, and it scales to a lot of nodes. Then we add our 3-layer DA protocol. This guarantees that data is always recoverable, even in the pessimistic case, but also allows data to be recovered very quickly in the optimistic case. And then finally, we have an incentive-aligned builder exchange that allows builders to actually actively participate in the protocol and form and disseminate tickets or certificates. And this builder exchange protocol is, the incentives are aligned between the proposer and the builders. And so there may be edge cases where this protocol doesn't work, but for the majority of situations, both parties are incentivized to behave honestly. All right, and then one final note is that Hotshot is open sourced under the MIT license, and it's free for anybody to use. All right, and then thank you.
Thank you. We have time for some questions. Please approach the microphones. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I'm curious about your model. So you spoke about bribery. You spoke about an adversary that controls less than 1/3% or 1/3 of the stake, but then they can bribe adaptively or even retroactively the rest of the parties who are acting rationally. So I understand that the adversary controls less than 1/3, but they're Byzantine, and the rest of the parties are rational, so you don't have honesty assumptions. Is that right?
So it's slightly different. We're assuming that you will have 2/3 of the nodes that are going to act honestly, and that basically you're assuming that the adversary does not have enough money to bribe more than 1/3 of the nodes. And if they don't have enough money to do that, the other nodes will act honestly. Does that make sense?
So the rest of the nodes are rational or honest?
They're rational, but the adversary can't pay them, so their rational response is to follow the protocol because they're not going to get paid otherwise.
Okay, so you have less than 1/3 adversarial Byzantine, and the rest are rational, and then you have a proof that these are acting honestly under that. But I'm curious because that seems to be the model for the middle protocol, but the Hot Stuff 2 protocol is not exactly in that model, right? So you have 2 different models, or how is it?
No, it's the same model. So the Hot Stuff 2 protocol is adapted to work in proof of stake, so we assume that no more than 1/3 of the stake will act dishonestly. You're right that there's a little bit of tension between the 2 models. So I wouldn't say that they're 2 different models, but yes.
It looks like the one model is 1/3 adversary Byzantine and 2/3 rational for the middle layer. And then the model for the first protocol is 1/3 Byzantine and the rest are honest. So there seems to be a discrepancy here.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think that we can still assume with the Hot Stuff protocol that the actors are rational. So you could say, well, what if an adversary in that protocol wanted to also bribe people? Well, they could bribe people to double sign, but again, they don't have enough money to bribe more than 1/3. So the rest of the 2/3 of the network are going to behave honestly because they're not getting paid enough to behave dishonestly.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Next question on that side here.
Other questions on like the builder design. Also, like congrats and thank you for open sourcing the code. I'll find time to read through it. But on the builder design, there's like 2 questions here. So like if you do like multiple builders for multiple rollups, is there some kind of looking into like shared builder, composable building, whatever, right? Like if you don't want, presumably, one builder have to build a block that is for like all 100 rollups. So like how do you kind of integrate those together, like a merging mechanism or whatever, maybe that intersects with multiple concurrent proposer-ish designs. And then another question on kind of like how like what happens if you have a builder that like doesn't provide a block, and it like does that cause the like that where like progress was just like an empty block? Is there some like fallback? I don't know if we'd really call it like an inclusion list, but like some fallback design where the proposer can essentially have like a default block that they're going to go with if the builder doesn't provide something for that?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll answer your first question first. So in the multiple builder design. This wasn't in the paper, but we're planning on running some sort of an auction or a lottery. But the sequencing rights are going to be auctioned off as the whole roll-up sequencing rights. And basically the idea is that you can let the market decide what they want composability between. So if the market really values 2 roll-ups being synchronously composable, the bidder or the builder will value that highly, and they'll win the marketplace for that specific slot. And then if there's 2 roll-ups that really have very low activity between them, then they may be built by separate builders. And then to your next question, sorry, could you remind me?
Just like what, like, yeah, I guess like is there's an auction, right? So there's some implied kind of like auction that I guess is like in protocol that is playing the like relay entity through like the threshold encryption. So maybe that answers it in the idea that presumably, you know, you just like there's nothing in the, I'm forgetting like whatever like Mike Norda's design is, right? But there's like a separation of like you have like an execution block that is like empty, and you can fall back to like a default block or like an inclusion list block. Is there any thinking about that?
Yeah, so in this particular design, there is no such thing as a fallback block. And the reason is because there's this tension between the builder and the proposer, where the proposer might say, hey, the builder did actually send their block data, but I'm going to pretend that they didn't, and then I'm going to try to steal it. And so it's very difficult to design a protocol where the proposer can still propose an empty block, but also not try to screw the builder. So in this case, if a builder does not actually release that data, then the view will fail, so you'll have a timeout. Basically, you'll go into a pessimistic condition, and the next proposer will have to build off an older block.
Gotcha. And like if, you know, it is fine if a builder just wants to like bid higher than any full block with like an empty block, and we just accept that like in a rational market that's probably not optimal.
Yes, exactly.
One more question, please, only one.
Yeah, thanks for the nice presentation. So for me, one of the key benefits that rollups have, or the reason why they unlock this fast performance, is that they don't have to do the consensus, right? But it seems that with the Espresso, you are building an overlay consensus on top of Ethereum. So it's a little bit backwards, and I want to understand what is the uplift that these rollups will get, because now you need a consensus, and then this leader can be faulty, and then you all, so yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So today, rollups generally have what we call centralized sequencers, and like you said, they're one party that sequences. And this is very performant, but it's not very ideal from a decentralization or a trust standpoint. This one sequencer could decide to censor transactions, and since they're the only person there, other people can't really do anything about it. The sequencer could also go offline for a really long time.
Just to be precise, I want to understand what is the additional overhead on the L2, and what's the experience? Because it seems that you could have, if Hotshot was the Ethereum's consensus layer, then you would not even have a rollup, because it would just be this, right? You were just saying that there will be no rollups on top of this.
Yeah, that is true, yes.
Okay.
Good, thank you. One last question from me, perhaps.
Yeah.
You mentioned you have threshold encryption. Are you using, but I understood you're not using it for encrypted mempool or causality preservation, right? Why is that?
So this is a good question. So our design actually can work with an encrypted mempool, but we're going to leave it up to the rollups to decide. So if a rollup wants to have an encrypted mempool, they can still facilitate that and send the Espresso network encrypted transactions, but it's more of a choice for each individual rollup if they want to do that, and we're not making the choice for all rollups in our design.
Good, thank you. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
It's now time for perhaps a real espresso, perhaps for a real coffee. There's a coffee break scheduled, and the session resumes at 3:30 with Snarks.
Okay, we're going to start our last session of the day. So if everybody could grab a seat. We have 4 fantastic talks on snarks and applications of snarks. So before we start the session, I just wanted to make 2 quick announcements. First of all, I wanted to remind everybody that after the session is over, there's going to be a reception. The reception is here. It's going to start at, well, right there. It's going to start at 5:40, so don't rush off and stay for the reception. It'll be a lot of fun. And then, of course, we'll go to the evening events. So that was my first announcement. The second announcement is I wanted to remind everyone that tomorrow, just before lunch, we're going to do the lightning talks session. So everybody should prepare a lightning talk. You can speak for like 2 to 3 minutes. Basically, we'll kind of line up along the wall, and everybody will come up to the stage in the order, first come, first serve. So if anybody wants to present tomorrow, that now is a good time to think about a topic to present. There's no need to register. You just line up along the wall, come up, and you can present for 2 to 3 minutes. Okay, so with that, let's start our ZK session. And our first talk is going to be about vulnerabilities in snark systems. So, Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you. Okay, my name is Stefanos. I'm a PhD student at Imperial College London, and I'm also a security researcher at ZK Security. I'm going to talk about vulnerabilities in snark implementations and in systems using snarks. This is a joint work with Jens, David Theodore, David Wong, Mohammed, and Benjamin Lifshitz. So, I will start by discussing what is the current state of ZKPs in production, and also why we should care about ZKP vulnerabilities. Then I will briefly outline in which parts of the process when using snarks we can introduce bugs and what kind of bugs. And then I will briefly discuss what could be the impact of ZKP vulnerabilities and what are the threat models. And finally, I will present a taxonomy of ZKP vulnerabilities we did, and also what kind of defenses are already have been implemented and what we can do next. So at the moment, we have various usages of ZK proofs. Some of them are on-chain, some of them are off-chain. The biggest one, I would say at the moment, is ZK rollups. But we also have Zcash, which has been pioneering that field for quite a while. And lately we have various, what I call them, ZK apps. And one example is ZK Login that will be presented right after my talk. And we have some private programmable L1s and L2s that heavily utilize ZKPs and some off-chain apps. And although we have all those different systems deployed and used by many users, there have been no single major exploit up until now. And although there haven't been any major exploit, there have been various critical vulnerabilities in systems in production. So there was a critical vulnerability in Zcash for quite a while, and someone from within Zcash identified it and fixed it. There was a vulnerability in Tornado Cache in production again. It was identified by some white hacker, and then it was patched. And there have been disclosures in systems that run in production, and there have been huge bug bounties given to white hackers again that identify the vulnerabilities. And finally, during audit reports, in many of those audit reports, there are like critical security findings. But still, no exploits. And there are 2 hypotheses. The first one is that there is no enough return of investment for attackers, but I don't think that's the case anymore, because many of those systems handle a lot of value, so attackers could actually make a good profit. And the second argument is that ZKPs are complicated, and especially if you compare them with smart contracts, are more complicated, which I also don't think it's quite true now, especially with all the efforts of creating new classes and writing books and blog posts about ZKPs. So, for example, this is the underlying issue in one of the previous vulnerabilities, and it's pretty simple for anyone that has ever written circuit code to understand what's wrong here. And basically, due to that vulnerability, someone could have basically get everything out of Tornado Cache. So at the moment, there has been some efforts. For example, there is the ZK bug tracker from 0xSpark that they have 25 vulnerabilities. But we wanted to further systemize the knowledge of what's going on in the space in terms of security. So first of all, I will start with a very high-level overview of how we see the different layers involved when using snarks. So we start with a public relation, like we call it R here. It can be a program, it can be some specification, some logic we want to implement in a circuit. So the first step is to write the circuit, to handwritten the circuit. And that process can introduce many bugs, and we will see later that the majority of vulnerabilities are there. The next layer is the front end. So basically the front end serves two main functionalities. The first is to compile the circuit to an intermediate representation, and that later can be our arithmetization, for example, R1CS. And the second process that the front end performs is the witness generation. That takes some public input, some private input, the circuit, and produces our trace and our witness, which includes some private part, we call it W, and some public part, which we call it X. And then we have the backend that basically implements the three main functions of the snarks, which is the pre-processing, the proving, and the verification. And in both frontends and backends, there could be many bugs. And if we have a critical vulnerability, for example, in our snark verifier, that it's typically handwritten nowadays, but it can also automatically produced by our framework. Then it doesn't matter if our circuit is secure. Someone can exploit that vulnerability if our usage actually is impacted by that vulnerability. And finally, we have the integration layer, which is basically our application for on-chain applications. You can think of it like the smart contract that basically interacts with the verifier, or it could also be like some client-side code that interacts with the prover, etc. And lately, there has been a lot of work with ZK-VMs, and the only thing that changes is that we give as input to the ZK-VM a program, and then we have the ZK-VM circuit, which is not, those circuits are not written by the end developers, but still there could be bugs there. So another way to see it is in a hierarchical manner. And here I have added two more layers, which is the hardware, the operating system, and the runtime, and the field arithmetic and elliptic curve libraries. And there could be bugs there. And if there are bugs there, our applications, our systems could be still exploited. But in this work, we don't focus on that. And what I want to show with that slide is that any bug on the lower layers can affect all the layers above. So if you have a bug in the front end, even if your circuits are correct and your application is correct, still your application can be exploited. Okay, so here are the basic properties that ZKPs provide, and for those properties we use zero-knowledge proofs. First is knowledge soundness, then perfect completeness, and finally zero knowledge. So we want all those properties to hold, and we don't want the bugs to affect these properties. And here are our three basic adversaries that we identified. The first one is the network adversary, which basically just can observe the system and the public values. The second one is an adversarial user that can submit inputs to a non-malicious prover that will then generate the proof. And finally, we have the adversarial prover, which has the ability to produce and manipulate proofs and submit them to the verifier. To better understand these three adversaries, here is basically a very high-level overview of a ZK rollup where we have the user. The user submits some transactions to an L2 node that performs both the sequencing and the proving. And then the L2 node submits the proof to the on-chain verifier. So in our second thread model adversary, what it means, it's basically that only the user can be adversary and not the sequencer prover, but that's not our end goal. So when we do any analysis, we should consider the latest thread model where the prover can basically try to create a proof that will surpass the verifier. Okay, and what could be the impact of ZKP vulnerabilities? First, we can break soundness, which means that a prover can convince a verifier of a false statement. Secondly, we can break completeness, which means that either the prover cannot produce a proof for some valid inputs, or the verifier cannot verify the proof, a correct proof. And finally, breaking zero knowledge, which means that we have some information leakage about the private witness. So in our study, we selected 141 bugs, mainly from audit reports, vulnerability disclosures, and bug trackers. We only considered critical security vulnerabilities, and we did not consider any non-ZKP related vulnerabilities, such as reentrancy bugs in smart contracts. And here are our high-level results. So the majority of vulnerabilities are in the circuit layer, and the majority is also soundness bugs, which is the worst bug that can happen when we use ZKPs, because basically in the context of a ZK rollup, if there is such a bug and someone managed to exploit it, then all the funds could be drained from the ZK rollup. So why is the circuit layer the most tricky one, according to those results? Is what we identified is that there is a different programming model than the one that developers are used to. So basically, when you write a circuit, you have to think about both computation and constraints. And another way to think about it is computation is the work that will mainly performed by the prover, and constraints are the constraints that are going to be checked by the verifier. And beyond that, also when you write a circuit, typically you will have to do some tricks to optimize your circuit, to reduce the constraints, or basically to translate some logic from like your a program that you want to prove to a circuit, and that's pretty tricky. And sometimes both of them can be happen in the same part of the code. For example, here is a circum, and here we both define constraints, but we also perform the computation. But in other DSLs like Hello 2, you have different parts of the code that one part of the code will do the computation and the other one will define the constraints. And there are three main types of vulnerabilities that can happen in the circuit layer. The first is under-constrained vulnerabilities, which means that we haven't fully add all the constraints to our circuit. So there could be some corner cases that we might have missed that can lead mainly to soundness bugs. Over-constrained vulnerabilities that are not that common, but mainly lead to completeness bugs. And there could be computational and hints errors, which is more on the computational side. Our constraints might also be buggy in that case, but it's more like how we're performing the witness generation. And we did a complete root cause analysis, and you can find more about all the different root causes in our paper. But here we have many examples for each of those root causes. But here I have basically highlight three different types. First, one root cause is that there is a different programming model, and that makes the life of developers harder and more tricky. And for another issue here is that most ZK DSLs are too low level, so it's kind of tricky how to use them, and you have to be very professional to write proper circuits that are secure. The second one is that we identified that most circuits that have critical bugs actually implement some cryptographic primitives that are difficult to get right in circuits, but also developers try to perform aggressive optimizations that also introduced various vulnerabilities. And finally, there still could be common errors like API misuse, etc. And those are the main root causes we identified during our study. I have some examples, but I really suggest to look at the paper to see more examples. I want to highlight here that most of the fixes, of the mitigations, are kind of trivial. One very typical fix is to add a rain check that you might have forgot, or to add some constraints that you forgot in the circuit. The next layer is the integration layer, and we identified 4 main vulnerabilities. I want to focus on the first one because it was the most popular one. Around 80% of vulnerabilities in that layer is passing unchecked data. And here, one example. And what happens here is that in circuits, mainly for optimization reasons, sometimes we have implicit assumptions that are not checked in the circuit, but we delegate that to the application layer to perform one check before calling the verifier, for example. And here it was a critical vulnerability that basically we didn't check a value we passed to the circuit that it's less than our snark field. And that could lead to other more severe issues in the application logic. The next layer is the front-end and back-end layer. In the front-end, there are very few vulnerabilities. We also believe the reason is because there have not been that many audits and people have not paid that much attention in the front-end. For example, if you start trying to implementing aggressive optimizations in your compiler, that might lead to severe vulnerabilities. And in the backend, the most common error is unsafe verifier. And verifiers can be either handwritten or automatically produced, and it's pretty common to have some issues there. Most of those issues have been detected through auditing, whereas for some other bugs, it's either through disclosures or the teams working on the protocols have identified them. Finally, I want to briefly discuss what is out there as a security tooling. So people have tried to use formal methods to identify mainly circuit vulnerabilities. So we have circumspect and ZK-app, which is basically static analyzers for circum. Then we have correct, which is a static analyzer that also uses some SMT solvers to identify bugs in Hello 2. And then we have a number of formal verification tools that mainly focus on identifying if there is under constraintness or proving that the circuits are not under constraint. And finally, we have some fuzzing tool, which is Snark Probe. And we had some mainly academic work on trying to find front-end compiler bugs. I would say that at the moment, only very few ZK DSLs have any security tooling. And also those tools have various issues from scalability issues, for example. It's a major concern in all the formal verification tools. Although there have been a good progress, I think there is a lot more space of experiment with formal methods to detect vulnerabilities in both ZK circuits, but also in the backend and in the frontend. For example, in the backend, there is some effort lately to verify the verifier, which could be interesting and could make using snarks much more secure. So finally, we also identified that there are some more theoretical attacks, vulnerabilities, and the main root cause is either there are errors in the original proof system descriptions, or there are some incomplete descriptions. So it's up to developer how will implement a specific snark, and the developer then might introduce some vulnerabilities. So, in conclusion, why do we have bugs in snarks? I would say that snarks, it's not just math. There could be implementation bugs that can break all the nice properties that snarks provide. And then here is a quote from Ron Rivest. He wrote that in around 90s for digital signatures, that users are being given enough rope with which to hang themselves, because basically they have to define some security parameters. And here I think the situation is even worse, because users are exposed to cryptography to the outer layers. So providing better abstractions, it's pretty critical to reduce the number of bugs we have in ZKPs. And also the complexity and the different threat model we have in ZKPs might lead to many vulnerabilities. And another issue we observed is that most protocols do not have specification, especially applications that using snarks, they don't clearly define what they are trying to do in not even a formal way, even in an informal way. And I think if we had more specifications, it would be much easier to identify vulnerabilities earlier. And what we can do, we can create more learning resources to educate developers on how to properly write circuits. We can start writing more specifications and even develop tools to make it easier to write specifications for systems using snarks. And then we should implement, and there are already some DSLs that are more easy to use and more secure, because some bugs are not possible in those ZK DSLs by default. Some examples are Leo and Noir. And we can also develop better testing and security tools. As testing tools, I mean any framework that will enable developers to write tests to check for soundness issues, for completeness issues, up to like fully, formally verify our stack. So that's it. Our paper is going to present also in Usenix Security this year, in about a week, and here you can find our preprint. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Great. We have time for one or two questions. If anybody has any questions. Yeah, Aline.
Hey, Stefanos, thanks for the talk. Really nice work, very useful for the community. You mentioned Halo 2 versus CIRCOM in terms of separating computation from verification. What did you find in your work? Did you find that one leads to less bugs than the other? And what would you recommend for a DSL to do? And maybe in general, you can speak to what a DSL should look like to minimize these types of errors.
I couldn't say that this is a main reason why we have bugs, that everything is like in a single function or in different functions. I would say what we identified about the ZK DSL is that if the DSL is very low level, so there is basically no types, just working in a field, then bugs are way more easier to happen. Whereas if you have a type system and better abstractions for developers, then you can eliminate many classes of the vulnerabilities we have in our taxonomy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, I have a question. Oh, sorry, there's a question here. Please go ahead.
One thing, I don't know quite if this is what you meant by front end, maybe not, but many of the kind of classical mistakes that we get in crypto, like the cofactor things, are not being permitted even by very low-level libraries. But you would possibly change these things if you. So first of all, if you're going to try and deploy something really heavily optimized, you would maybe use different types of snarks together and all these other things. Or you might try clearing cofactors in the pairings. There's lots of other things that people will probably try and do once things stabilize, and that will be whole new thing.
Yeah, so the question is like, if there are more optimizations in the front-end layer, then there will be more bugs. Yeah, and I think it's important to take basically some knowledge from other communities like C compilers and what they have done to identify optimization bugs, which is a major issue in C compilers and in SMT solvers, and try to define the oracles and develop techniques to detect such bugs in ZKP frontends.
Actually, so following up on that, do you think a way to reduce bugs is to try and use multiple proof systems at once? Or is that not going to help?
That could be an interesting case, but then you have some cost issues, right?
Of course.
You have to produce two proofs, so there is a trade-off.
Yeah.
But probably you could eliminate some of the bugs if you do that.
All right, very cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Stefanos. Okay, our next speaker is Deepak. Is Deepak here? There you are. Yes, here's your mic. And yeah, Deepak is going to talk about ZK login. Looking forward to your talk.
All right. Knock, knock. Yes. Hi, everyone. This is Deepak. Today, I'll talk about ZK login. A little bit about me. I'm a research scientist at Miston Labs, the company behind Sui blockchain. I'll talk about ZK login, which is a new feature that we have launched. It is deployed on the Sui blockchain. At a high level, our goal with ZK login was to create a really user-friendly wallet experience that makes onboarding much more easier for users. So exactly what is the problem, right? Just to give a little bit of context, a recent study kind of shows that there's about 100 million active crypto wallets today. And at the very least, this is like an order of magnitude low than the number of total internet users. So now the question is, why is there such a big gap? Now there may be many reasons for it, but I contend that one of the main reasons is how hard it is for users to use Web3 applications. Any of you who has onboarded onto a wallet can probably attest to what I'm talking about, but even otherwise, this is sort of a typical onboarding experience you'll see today. First of all, you'll have to install an extension or an app, which in and of itself is a bit of a hurdle because you, as a user, you're supposed to take an action. Let's say you go ahead, you install an extension, and then you're supposed to remember a 16-word recovery phrase, right? No one likes this. It's sort of the equivalent of remembering, let's say, 4 or 5 passwords at once. No one likes remembering even a single password. And even some wallets even force you to make sure that you actually have remembered this and confirm that you have remembered it, and they kind of won't leave you until you actually fill this up. And finally, after you've done all that and you haven't uninstalled the app, you can then go ahead and use your blockchain. And this is kind of the state of where Web3 wallets are. And so the key hypothesis, you can say, is that we think that mnemonics alone aren't going to get us mass adoption for blockchain applications. So what do we want, right? At a high level, the idea is to think if we can make it as easy to sign blockchain transactions as it is to, let's say, sign in with Google or Apple on the internet, right? When we browse the internet, when we go to different websites, people don't create a new password for every website you browse. People usually use an existing account that they use and kind of reuse the account to log into different accounts. Kind of extending the same idea, we ask ourselves, well, can we sign blockchain transactions using existing accounts? And this may sound like magic a little bit. Hopefully I convince you otherwise in the next few slides. But technically speaking, the way this works today just on the internet is broadly using OAuth. Now, OAuth, at a high level, the way it works is you pick an OAuth provider of your choice. There are many, many, many OAuth providers. Let's say Google, Facebook, Apple, etc. And at a high level, OAuth designs the flows to convince an OAuth client, which is the website you're logging into, about certain information from the source account. Let's say that is your Google account. And this is how things work on the internet today. And we ask ourselves how we can realize a wallet with that. And it turns out that it's not too hard to do it if we are willing to introduce a custodian into the picture. What do I mean by that? Well, if there was a party who can hold a private key for you and kind of do this transaction signing for you, then that party can just be the OAuth client. You expose a simple and user-friendly experience to the user. The user never needs to care about what it means to remember a recovery phrase or any of that. And so, if user experience was the only goal, then this could work in principle. But really, the challenge here is to see if we can do all of this in a way that we avoid having to introduce a custodian. And this is for many reasons, just to reduce the number of single points of failure, just to avoid trusting yet another entity. And so this is exactly what we do. ZK Login allows users to use OAuth along with zero-knowledge proofs to sign blockchain transactions. It is everything that I promised. It's primarily very user-friendly. It's also important. Privacy is important here in the context that these existing accounts may have sensitive information attached to the user, so you don't want to necessarily reveal this information to arbitrary parties. So let's get into the technical portion of the talk, and I'll explain how it works now. A brief primer on OpenID Connect. So OpenID Connect is a specification that sits on top of OAuth. So not every OAuth provider implements OpenID Connect, but luckily for us, most of the popular providers do. And I'll only cover one detail of OpenID Connect that is relevant for us, which is the identity token. So as part of the OpenID Connect flow, as the user is signing in to Google or Apple or whichever it is, there is this ID token that gets sent by the OpenID provider to the OAuth client. And this ID token looks something like this. It has a header, a payload, and a signature. Most widely used is RSA signatures. So basically, the OpenID provider is issuing a signature over basic user information in order for the OAuth client to consume and basically get basic information about the user. So this can be things like the name of the user, the email of the user, and other such very, very basic things. So the key idea for us is if we can use a JWT as the equivalent of a private key. So everything you would imagine you would want to do with a private key, signing transactions, etc., we ask if it is possible to do with the knowledge of this JWT. This is a more realistic JWT from Google. So the payload has many fields. I'll just cover some that are sort of relevant to the talk. So nonce is an important one. So nonce is the only field in this payload that the client can control. So the nonce is there to prevent replay attacks. So as a client, you can set a nonce and ask Google to sign on it. And you can then check that the nonce that was returned was the same one that you set. And so you're convinced that there's no replay attacks there. But other than that, it just has very basic information like user identifiers and such. Okay, so we have this JWT. Well, how do we authorize a transaction? Now, there's many ways to do it. The way we go about it is to create a key pair. I call it an ephemeral key pair because as a user, you do not need to remember it. You can kind of forget it as soon as you use it. And we insert the ephemeral public key into the nonce field. So as I said, nonce is the only field in this payload that the client can control. So we exploit that property. So what do we have here? Basically, we have a certificate over the freshly created key pair. And so the basic idea is that we can then use the corresponding ephemeral private key to sign transactions. So we authorize transactions with JWTs in sort of a two-step way. You create a key pair, insert the public key into the nonce, and then use the corresponding private key to sort of sign transactions. A second challenge is identifying the user without while respecting users' privacy. So what do I mean by that? So as I said, this JWT has certain user identifiers. ISS is an identifier for the OpenID provider, Google. AUD is an identifier for the client, which in this case would be the wallet. SUB sub is an identifier that identifies the user uniquely, and that is where some privacy concerns arise. Basically, some providers like Google use the same identifier for the user across all the websites and apps that the user may sign into. So, if you sign into Google in 100 different apps, all the apps will receive and identify you using the same sub value. And so the challenge for us is, well, how do we identify the user on chain without necessarily making the sub value public? So the way we do that is by introducing a salt. A salt is nothing but a persistent secret, so someone has to remember it across sessions. And the sole purpose of it, I kind of want to highlight this, the sole purpose of it is for unlinkability, meaning unlinking the two identities, the on-chain and the off-chain. Specifically, it doesn't play any role in security here. So the whole point of it is to just unlink the two identities. A minor note, instead of sub, we could also have based the on-chain account on other fields in the JWT. So for example, we could have created an email-based wallet if the JWT provider sends an email. And so there's a lot of flexibility in how we construct an on-chain address for the user, depending on the claims that the JWT provider gives us. So a key question is, who maintains the salt? It's sort of a tricky one because the whole point of our system is to kind of make sure that the user doesn't need to remember yet another secret. Now, the good thing for us is that the secret is not the same level of sensitivity as a mnemonic because it isn't for security, it's only for privacy. And so we can exploit that a little to make our task easier. So for example, in some cases, it may be possible to just sort of store it on client side so that the user actually never sees it, and it kind of just gets used whenever the user is signing a transaction. Some edge cases arise to kind of sync across devices that kind of need handling. I'm happy to talk about those for those that are interested later. It may also be a reasonable choice to store it on the server side. By that, I mean that each wallet can sort of store the salts or back up the salts of their users and kind of create an experience for the users where they kind of are not exposed to the salt. Again, there's many options for how we can store the salt on the server side. This can be stored even in plain text if the privacy model kind of is okay. Because again, the key point here is that the user has a different account with each app. So the salt is kind of different across apps. So maybe it's okay for an app to kind of store the salt on the server side in plain. But interesting models like using MPC are also possible here. Finally, I haven't kind of explained what all claims are in the JWT, but I have kind of touched upon how certain claims are sensitive. For example, the sub can be sensitive. And I've also said that there are claims like email. So clearly, you kind of don't want to reveal the JWT publicly on chain just for the privacy reasons. And there may also be some security reasons for which you may not want to do that. But even just for the privacy reasons, it's probably not a good idea. And so here we we use the magic box of snarks, and we prove that you have a valid JWT, and you know the salt that kind of derives to an on-chain address. I've kind of briefly listed out the precise, somewhat precise actions that we kind of implement in the snark circuit. So the snark will have to check the signature on the JWT. It will have to check that the nonce has the ephemeral public key, and it will have to check that the address derivation was done appropriately. So I'll talk a little bit more about the snark operations a little later. But yeah, just to quickly summarize, so the whole process starts with creating an ephemeral key pair, injecting that into the nonce, getting a JWT from the OpenID provider on the nonce, on the JWT, and then generating a zero-knowledge proof that proves its validity, and also proves the binding between the ephemeral public key and your on-chain address. And so every on-chain transaction, every on-chain ZK login transaction has two parts to it, a zero-knowledge proof and ephemeral private key signed transaction. So the zero-knowledge proof is there to bind the ephemeral public key to the address, and the ephemeral private key signed transaction is there to authorize the transaction. Finally, we want to be able to prove and actually submit a transaction quite fast. So for the moment, we chose Groth 16 to implement the previously explained snark. But today, proofs are slow, so we come up with a way to delegate proving to an untrusted ZKP service. What do I mean by untrusted? I mean that the ZKP service, even if we have one, cannot alone sign transactions. So even if it is fully malicious, it can't sign transactions and kind of steal users' assets. So you can also kind of ask if it is possible to do the delegation in a privacy-preserving way, which is a bit of an open problem for now. But I guess at a high level, the point is that zero-knowledge proofs can either be generated locally or delegated, and delegation is not too bad because it can be done without having to trust another entity here. Just quickly talking a little about the circuit itself. The main operations and the costliest operation is SHA-2. So as I said before, every provider we've seen uses RSA with SHA-2 today. So which means that, and basically those are the most expensive operations. We have some interesting tricks with regards to JSON parsing and other things to optimize the basically rest of the operations beyond other than the signatures. Today the prover is based on RapidSnark, and I'll talk a little about the latencies now. So this was benchmarked on a machine, on a not too powerful machine, think about 16 cores. So the zero-knowledge proof generation takes just about 3 seconds, and the end-to-end transaction confirmation time is also about 3 to 4 seconds. The key point to note here is that a single zero-knowledge proof can be reused across transactions. So as I said before, you just bind an ephemeral key pair, and so you can then reuse the ephemeral private key as long as that is remembered, which typically is remembered across at least a session, but the length of a session kind of depends on the device. So if you're in a mobile context, maybe you can remember it for longer. If you're in a browser context, it can be remembered for a slightly smaller time. But the point is that this end-to-end latency is not really experienced by the end user for every transaction that they're signing. So there's a little bit of a nuance on what they actually experience in practice. Finally, as I said, we've deployed it on SWI, and so I have a small demo, which I hope it works. Yes, there you go. So user uses Google. Here, I don't know if I can pause it to add a little bit of comment, but the point is that the user is likely already logged into Google. That's why there wasn't a password prompt. It kind of automatically happened. And there you go. Let me see if I can rerun it just to see if it works. Yeah, okay, there you go. So yeah, so today we support many providers, Google, Facebook, and Twitch, Apple, Slack, Microsoft, etc. We are also planning to add more. As you can see, this is where the zero knowledge proof generation is happening. That's why it's taking slightly longer. But yeah, overall it is fairly smooth. Okay, just to quickly talk about some of the properties and interesting features that ZK Login gives us. I think the most interesting one is that it allows creating email or phone-based accounts. If basically whatever identity information the JWT has, we can use and create accounts directly for those. Now, previously I mentioned the use of salt, but maybe in some cases, like if you're a content creator, it may be okay for you to reveal the email publicly, and then it kind of becomes a discoverable account. So there's like a one-to-one mapping between your off-chain identity and your on-chain identity, and anyone can see and know who you are based on just looking at your on-chain address. And that can be interesting. It's also possible to kind of create anonymous accounts. So maybe you hide a part of your email address and create one account for, let's say, I'm a Cornell alum, so all of Cornell users can kind of use a blockchain account, maybe for voting or something else. It's also possible to create embedded wallets. So what I mean by that is the typical wallet experience is always either you have an extension or a mobile app or somewhere where your wallet exists. But with ZK Login, well, you can just have a wallet directly in your app. So there's no need for another pop-up or another hurdle in the user experience for users. And one of the concerns we've received from builders as we've launched it was with regards to security. So there are certain DeFi applications which care about high security, and maybe they worry about keeping the account assets safe even if your Google account gets hacked, for example. And in cases like that, it can be useful to create like a 2 out of 3 between Google, Facebook, and Apple. And so then even if your Google account gets hacked, you're good. So that can also be interesting. And I guess last but definitely not the least, the whole point of this adventure is to create an account that is very, very, very hard to lose, which is kind of granted to us here thanks to the robust recovery paths in these existing accounts. All right, I will end my talk here. Thank you so much.
Great, very cool. Actually, before we get any questions, could you say a little bit about usage? Like how many ZK proofs are you generating every day now as a result of this?
I think, I remember sometime this year when we celebrated, 100K ZKPs overall. I'm sure we've reached, I don't know, 300K or something now in total. That's the number of ZKPs.
ZKP total,
yeah, so the number of on-chain ZK login transactions maybe more.
So this is a pretty significant use of ZKs in the world today.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't have stats about other ZKP users like in Zcash and others to compare, but this it sounds significant. Yes.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, please.
Thanks for the nice talk. And I wanted to ask to what extent this application will be tied to these authentication providers, and in case, for example, they decide to not allow this product to connect, will the users be completely disconnected with the service, or is there a way for the users to then connect with a traditional path?
Yeah, so there's a couple different things here. So if we build the account from emails, then we have more flexibility because your email can be authenticated by different providers, and potentially they can issue you JWTs on that, and we can then base everything on your emails, and there's some flexibility there. But if we base it on sub, it is a little more harder because the subject identifier is by definition an identifier issued to you by the ad provider. Yeah, so I think it kind of depends, but it is certainly possible to do this in a way that you are keeping yourself flexible from the OpenID provider.
Thank you.
Hi. So any reputable OIDC provider rotates out their certificates every couple of weeks. How do you manage that?
Yeah, so one aspect I did not quite talk about is how the verification works in like great detail. Basically, we need an oracle to fetch and post these public keys on chain. In the case of SUI, validators themselves perform this function. But if you want to instantiate it on another chain, I would imagine you just need these oracles to periodically check the endpoint. So basically, they post it on HTTPS endpoint. So the oracle just needs to repeatedly check and kind of fetch.
Okay. And second question, JWTs usually have a very strict expiration date. How is that managed?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways of dealing with expiration. What we do is we set up a different expiry time just to avoid the thing that you said. So we don't just insert the ephemeral public key into the nonce, we insert ephemeral public key along with an expiration time into the nonce, and the expiration time is therefore controlled by the client. And on chain, we verify that you're not just setting arbitrarily long expiry times. So maybe you can just set something like 1 or 2 days, but not like 1 year.
Does that expiration date match the JWT's expiration date?
No, it's slightly longer.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Hi, I think this is a really cool idea. I'm curious about salts. If I had some uniform and reliable way of transforming identifiers for applications into salts, and I wanted exactly one different identity per application, could I just use that and obviate the need to actually store salts for applications?
So if that transformation is public, then everyone knows your Google or whatever identity, yeah?
Well, it's not necessarily reversible. It's, so for example, if I took the hash of the app ID and used that as a salt, I prove in zero knowledge that I have some application that goes, that the hash of my email in the salt is this.
Yeah, no, it is reversible, I think, because the space of the subject identifiers is small, and if you use a hash of app ID as a sort, then I can just brute force and find which of these corresponds to a given address, right?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. It would be nice if we could do that.
So the salt is actually being incorporated into the ZKP in your thing, if I understood correctly. In principle, wouldn't it be possible to incorporate the salt outside of the ZKP or in another layer, or just on the side or something, maybe with a Peterson commitment or something, so that you could have a re-randomizable ZKP, or so you could reuse the re-randomization of ROS16, and then of course you would then need a browser plugin to use that, but then you could make the browser could make the ZKP once and then reuse it.
Sorry, the goal is to hide what from whom?
The goal is just to make it cheaper. So if the user's browser is doing this ZKP, and they're using a lot of different apps, then they could make it. They could make the ZKP once, and then their own browser plugin would enforce the OpenID connects, but then it would just use the single ZKP for itself.
Yeah, I don't think you can reuse it. Sorry, reusing a single ZKP across different apps may be challenging because different apps will have different JWTs. And so.
All right, sounds like maybe we can design this offline. Yeah, last question, please.
Would you consider private delegation using Ts? Why or why not?
Private delegation of ZKPs?
Yes.
And yeah, no, definitely it could be an interesting option. I mean, at the end of the day, the challenge is to delegate in a way that the delegatee doesn't know the witness. So T, if we can generate zero knowledge proofs inside T in like reasonably efficiently, then yes.
Thank you.
Cool, yeah, very cool project. Thank you, Deepak. All right, our next speaker is Ellie Ben Sasson from Starkware, who's going to tell us about the state of Stew. Ellie, are you here? Let me check on Ellie. Eli.
Yeah, just 1 second.
Okay, he's almost ready. I should have prepared the joke to tell while Eli is preparing. Actually, maybe I'll use this opportunity to remind everyone again that reception is starting at 5:40, so don't run off. There'll be a reception right outside. And there we go. Eli, the floor is all yours.
Okay, hello. I guess this is the clicker. Hello, hi everyone. Let's see. I'll wait for the slides to go. Yeah, so I want to tell you about Stu, but first I'll tell you a little bit about what came before Stu. So, a tale of two provers. Our first prover, oh wait, I'll go back and say. My name is Eli Ben Sasson. I'm co-founder and CEO of Starkware. Starkware has a team of about almost 200 folks, and we build Starks for production systems. So our first prover, which has been running in production for 4 years, called Stone, works over a 252-bit field. And there's a new prover that will be the focus of the talk that is running over a 31-bit field. And I want to tell you about it because we really love it, and I think you're going to love it as well. So before we get to Stu, I'll just say that Stone, we're very happy with its performance right now because it can support very great scale. It's already saved Ethereum users over $500 million and settled over $1.2 trillion over its life. And in fact, all of our StarkNet systems are currently already running over Stone and running very well, meaning, we're now in our next upgrade, which is coming out later this month. We can support TPS of upwards of 250, maybe even 300. And by the end of the year, this will go closer to 1,000. All of this uses Stone. And there are other nice things that are going to come in this upcoming upgrade, again, supported by Stone. For instance, you can do Groth 16 verification, 100 or more per block on StarkNet. So if you like layer 2s and you want to program stuff and you want, let's say, privacy-preserving layer 3s, things like Zcash-style things, you can do them today on StarkNet. So all of this is supported by Stone, which begs the question of, why would we want Stu? I want to tell you about 4 aspects of Stu. The connection to community, because it's a collaborative, open source project, and I would like to invite all of you to be involved in it. I want to tell you about the very fast timeline in which it's arriving. Then I want to tell you about the really exciting stuff, which is the innovations that go into there, the math and other stuff, and how fast it is. Okay, so.
And then eventually I got to 120 hashes per second, and I was really happy. And then I asked some lovely Starkware people, okay, how much do you guys get? And they told me 500,000. So, that definitely was interesting, right?
So this was Vitalik's reaction and the Ethereum Foundation's reaction to the fact that the Stu prover can show a throughput of upwards of 500,000 hashes, Poseidon hashes, proving 500,000 Poseidon hashes per second on a quad core. And on stronger machines, it goes over 1.2 million hashes per second. And I'll show you some numbers, and we'll dive into the details of what goes on there, which is probably 100x better than what the world has known before. So Stu is a collaborative project, which means it is open source, and it has a templatized backend that's supportable on multiple infrastructures and hardware settings like SIMD, GPUs, WASM, FPGA. So if you're interested in collaborating, you can either by yourself or talk to us and get involved in implementing or improving one of these backends. We already have a number of ongoing initiatives with external teams to build things like, first of all, we're talking with the Ethereum Foundation researchers about whether this can impact the roadmap of Ethereum, because now you can do things like signature aggregation and, sub-second data availability finality using Stu. So you can rethink the possibilities for Ethereum itself. We have a number of teams building GPU backends already. We have teams building a Stu verifier in Cairo, which is the Stark-friendly programming language that powers StarkNet. And we have a project about Stu verifier on Bitcoin, because we're also going to put Stu on Bitcoin within 6 months. Sorry, we're going to put StarkNet on Bitcoin within 6 months of having OpCat adopted, if it's adopted. And this will be thanks to Stu, and it will be done using Stu, and we have already shown together with Wei-King Chen and L2 Iterative how this can be done on Signet, Bitcoin Signet that has OpCat turned on. So if you want to collaborate more, there are a bunch of things you can do. For instance, right now the Starks we're building are not ZK, but you can turn them into ZK Starks, relatively well-known and not too hard project, but very interesting. You can write specific errors and constraint systems for various virtual machines like RISC-V, RISC-V, EVM, and so on and so forth. We will definitely be adding all of those, but right now our focus is first most on, I'll show you in a minute, on getting Stu to StarkNet. So all of these projects, if you want to build them, please talk to us. Benchmarking, comparing to other proof systems, building more backends. If you want to be involved, please reach out to us, or we have a table outside, or anyone with a Starkware shirt, please talk to us. There's a lot to be done here, and we have actually a bunch of Stu engineers with us. I see Andrew Milson in the back. If you see all the way to the back, you want to hear how it really works or talk about the code, talk to Andrew, because he knows it. Okay, so let's talk about the very vigorous timeline that we set. We started building Stu about roughly 1 year ago, and in June, you know, the recording I showed you of Vitalik speaking, that was last month, and it was talking about stuff that the Ethereum Foundation researchers discussed with us in June when we released the benchmark for Poseidon that sort of blew the mind away of many people, including ourselves, the 500,000 hashes proved on a quad core. I'm going to share with you later now our very nice numbers for Blake 2, which is a standard hash that we're releasing today. And I'm also going to share with you initial results on GPU backend. All of these things are going to be, so the Blake 2 is already open sourced and you can use it. The GPU is still in works, but I'm going to show you some initial numbers. In the fall, we're going to first have the air for the Cairo virtual machine, and shortly after we'll add all of the built-ins needed in order to have Stu performing recursion and operating inside StarkNet. Now what this means for StarkNet programmers, it means you do not need to change anything. All the contracts and all of the code will be running the same way it's been running today, but we will see faster finality, lower costs, the potential for client-side proving, and a whole bunch of other things. So the main thing here is that you will get a lot of improvement and reduced costs, but without changing anything, and all of this will reach you by March 25. Now I want to tell you a little bit about what is going under the hood with Stu. So how did it come about? And now I'm going to talk about this very beautiful math breakthrough called Circle Stark. It is joint work of Ulrich Habok from Polygon Labs and Shachar Papini and David Levitt from Starkware. You can look it up. It's a beautiful piece of math that I'm really excited about. So how did it come about? Well, we want a more efficient Stark than the one that we have, and we want it to be able to run very quickly over commodity CPUs and GPUs. Now, you all know that the basic units of operation on both CPUs and GPUs are 32-bit words. And you may also know that both of them support very fast integer arithmetic. CPUs also support the kind of arithmetic or the kind of operations needed for binary field multiplications, but unfortunately GPUs do not. Which means that if you want something that is very fast on both CPU and GPU, you probably want something that works with 32-bit integer arithmetic. Okay, so this leads us to pick something that fits. It's a prime field that sits inside a 32-bit word. Now, which ones? The one we already all know of and actually love is the one used, for instance, by the RISC-0 team called Baby Bear that actually has an FFT-friendly subgroup of size 2 to the 27, so you can do a lot of cool stuff with it. But there's an even better field that allows even faster multiplication, roughly 30% faster, and it is called M31 or Mersenne31, and it is the prime number 2 to the power 31 minus 1. And because 2 to the 31 equals 1, this leads to very fast multiplication, and we wanted to use it. The problem is that if you look at the multiplicative subgroup of this field, which is very much necessary for fast Starks, it doesn't have a nice structure. It doesn't have an FFT-friendly structure. So why is the FFT group needed? Well, it's needed both for fast evaluation, low-degree extensions, interpolations, which are needed when you're dealing with univariate polynomials, and it's also needed to run the protocol of Frey. So what can we do? We have this field that we would really like to work with because it really is fast, but it doesn't have the needed structure. So here's the multiplicative group of M31, and this is its size. Its prime factors are not very FFT friendly. You would like to see something like 2 to the high power times some small prime. But that's not the case here. Well, we already know, since our work with Dan Carmon, Swastiko Party, and David Levy from 2021, that you can find an elliptic curve of the right size and use that to get a group of size, let's say 2 to the 30-ish, and do everything you want. But it's a little bit complicated. The sequence of transitions and the twiddle factors you get are not very pleasant to work with. So the three brilliant mathematicians and engineers I mentioned earlier, Ulrich, David, and Shachar, suggested using an even simpler curve that we all remember from our days in high school, which is the circle, the set of points such that, if you square them and sum them up, you get 1. And you get 1 modulo the Mersenne prime. So for instance, the point 2 to the 15 is one of these points. And this turns out to have a very nice quadratic doubling map, and it's something very convenient to work with. It looks very FFT friendly. So there are some complications. For instance, a line intersects this curve at 2 points, which means that you have to deal, well, you're going to deal with bivariate polynomials as opposed to univariate polynomials. So things could be slightly less efficient, or it seems they might be less efficient. And if you look at the algebraic geometry, there are some complications there as well. You don't get a nice Riemann-Roch space. Luckily, these guys fixed all of those things, so it's safe to use, and it's as efficient as using the good old FFT and Frey's. So let's see what are the operations that are needed in terms of the group theory. There's an identity element, which is the point 1, 0. Doubling is sort of what you would expect it to be, sort of like angle addition. And the nice thing also about doubling is that if you look at the doubling and then projecting onto the x coordinate, you will see that there's no dependence on the y coordinate, which is very, very useful and helpful. And also the inverse of every point is just you flip the y coordinate. Okay. Then you have your subgroups and a coset of a subgroup. And if you take a coset of a subgroup in which there are 2 points above every point x, then you get what we call a canonical coset. And what's really nice about it is that you can have these projections onto the x-coordinate that are 2 to 1 projections. And basically, for every point that is projected onto, you have 2 points that are its preimage. And because of this, and because of the fact that doubling and projection commute, you can actually, and I'm jumping, I'm skipping over a lot of math, you can actually move from these bivariate polynomials immediately to a pair of univariate polynomials with no reduction in efficiency, and you're basically back in the world of good old things like FFTs and Frey's with univariate polynomials. So let's talk about what this translates to in terms of efficiency. So, okay, for those of you who attended, I gave a talk also about I think there it was about Frey versus KZG, or latest results on Starks. And one part of it that I think led to some contention was, I showed this slide. This slide was a back of the envelope estimate of how in an ideal vectorized world, why are small field Starks better than number theoretic constructions that have MSMs in them? And back then, a year ago, I used this slide. You can focus just on the very bottom that talks about we estimated that per word of commitment, you would take 35 to 40 clock cycles, and you would take roughly 40x more to do the same thing using an MSM-based KZG. So what we did this time is we actually measured, because now we have STU measurements, and we used, so let's just neglect everything else. So now I want to share with you the measurements that we recently did. If you take STU M31 and you measure it compared to the fastest vectorized version of KZG that we are aware of, which comes from the Dalek ECC library, and what you get is a factor of not 40 but 30, because you have 750 clock cycles per word using an MSM-based system, KZG, as opposed to 24.5, which is what we clocked using STU. So you get a 30x factor improvement when using small field Starks, which has been something that we advocated for since we founded StarCore 6 years ago. We knew that this will be the best and fastest thing to use. Now, we already shared this information that using STU, you can, on a quad core with AVX512, you can get 500,000 Poseidon hashes proved per second. And this is better than, for instance, what we could do with eStark over a 64-bit field, which was 10,000 per second. And it's certainly much better than what we can do with Stone, which is a 530 per second. This opens the door to things like sub-second recursion and sub-second state diff proving, which again, this is something that is very much interesting even for the Ethereum roadmap, because you can do very interesting stuff there to be elaborated upon in different time. It also allows you to put StarkNet on Bitcoin, because Bitcoin works with words that are 32 bits at most, so you really want to work with a Stark that has very few bits in it. What about standard hash functions? So now I want to share with you this information that is new, but it already appears in the GitHub of STU, which is what we get for Blake. So for Blake 2, we can prove 22,000, well, almost 23,000 hashes per second using, again, a quad core with AVX512. We estimate, but we haven't written this down, we estimate that SHA-2s you can get around 17,000 of them. And the best state-of-the-art that I'm aware of prior to this was the Plonky 3 numbers that come from a very powerful machine, right? An M3 Max that give you 2,500. So again, a very noticeable improvement in the number of hashes that you can do. And if you do a back of the envelope estimate for how much time would it take to do a recursive proof, to prove that you verified a Stark. So here are the current numbers, and they're not optimized. You can do much better. So if you use 3-bit grinding and, 30-bit grinding, and you want roughly 120 bits of security, and you make 90 queries, which give you a conjectured security of 120 bits, this leads, according to our current measurements, you're going to need to prove 24,000 Blakes. Well, we can prove 23,000 Blakes per second, which means that within 3 seconds, you can probably get a recursive proof. Now, things get even better because, as we do already today in our stack, we don't use the Blake hash all the way from the bottom to the top. We only use it for the lower layers, and at some point above, we start using something like Poseidon, which again, Poseidon, we can do hundreds of thousands per second. So probably with not a lot of work and optimization, you can get sub-second recursive proofs on a quad core, right, on a very simple laptop. Now, under the hood, what is going on here? So there's also a very nice arithmetization coming from the STU team that allows you to use, well, in the Stone system right now, when we want to encode a single Blake, we spend roughly between 70,000 and 100,000 cells. Each cell is a field element, and each field element is actually 252-bit fields. Because of the improvements in arithmetization and the use of things like logups and lookups, Poseidon, has always been around 200, so here it's also 200. But for Blake 2S, the thing that is on GitHub today uses about 7,000 cells. About 4,500 of them are Air Blake cells, and 2,600 of them are related to logup. Here are some initial measurements also. We're revealing this here for the first time from an external team that shows the efficiency, the initial efficiency, not optimized, of using a GPU for various parts. We don't yet have a good end-to-end measurement, for instance, for Poseidon. I hope this will come out in the coming few weeks. But you can see that you get speed-ups of anywhere between, let's say, 5 and 45x faster on the GPU, depending on which part of it is. And again, this is not yet optimized, but you can expect, upwards of 1 million and even more hashes proved per second on commodity GPUs, which is, again, extremely exciting. And again, this is code that will be open sourced and everyone can use it and test it. Now I want to show you a little bit about what is the time breakout of spending, where do we spend, where is the prover spending time, and what can we learn from it? So here you have this pretty, we'll share the slides so you can study them on your own. You can also run some scripts and get these numbers from the open source code. But this is the breakup of the time. Roughly 1/3 of it is related to generating the trace of the Stark. Roughly a little bit over 1/3 is related to generating the constraints and committing to them. And then roughly, well, something like 1/4 or so is related to doing the logup. And one interesting thing is that the whole fry, everything about the fry is like 1%. Like takes very little time. It's just 1% is related to using the fry protocol. Now, what can we learn from this? Okay, first of all, how much can this be improved on? So assuming we have the optimal implementation, which we don't have, but if you fix the following two things. If you're going to fix the fact that you're working over M31, and you're going to fix a specific arithmetization, let's assume that this is the very best arithmetization possible for the problem, then this already implies that you cannot do more than 10x better than what we have. Why? Because 10% is just spent on filling out the initial trace before doing any polynomial operations. Just writing down the values that you're using in your arithmetization takes 1/10 of the time we're spending right now. So even if everything else is optimized and it takes 0 time, you've only sped up the system by 10x, which is considerable, but I'm just saying it shows that you can't do a lot more. Now, if you are going to do anything between either an AIR or a GKR, and you're going to use an interactive protocol for basically doing a permutation argument, then actually you probably can't do better than 2.5x over what we have here. Why? Because these 3 red parts, again, they involve no low degree extension, no Merkle commitments, nothing of that sort. This is just writing down the values, the algebraic values that are needed in order to do all of the other stuff. And this already takes upwards of 40% or around 40% of the time. So you can at most, even if everything else were optimized, you can at most do 2.5 times better. Of course, you can, optimize the code more and then maybe things will look different. But I'm saying it seems that as long as you're working over a 32-bit field and using a specific arithmetization, this is pretty darn efficient. Another thing that is interesting is if you look at the time spent on FFTs and on Merkle commitments, they're roughly almost the same, or rather everything related to low degree extension, which is both an inverse FFT and an FFT, this takes roughly 2x the time that it takes to do the Merkle commitment. That's the current state of it. So hashing is very, very efficient, and so is FFTs, and they're roughly the same time. And I don't know how much time I have left. But I think I'm pretty much done, and I'm willing to take questions if I have. Or we can just go into Circle Stark and prove. I don't know how much time I have left. What? I have 5 more minutes. Okay, so I can either sing a song or I can just answer questions. But I'd rather answer questions.
Thank you, Eli. This is great. Was there more you wanted to present, or you presented everything?
There's no more to say, but I would love to answer questions.
Okay, let's take some questions.
Hi, thanks a lot for your talk. And my question is regarding how well this plays with Bitcoin. First of all, it's impressive that you've even considered building it for Bitcoin, given how weak it is. And I have kind of 2 questions. One is, how is that even possible that you can actually do that on Bitcoin? And the second is, did you at all think about Bitcoin when you were defining Circle Stark?
Oh, terrific questions. Okay. How is it exactly possible? I'm going to give a lot of credit to the brilliant researchers working on OpCat, people like Wei-King Chen from L2 Iterative, and on our team we have a lot of very smart researchers looking into how to put it on Bitcoin. It's darn hard because Bitcoin, it's like one of those scientific calculators. So with OpCat, what you can do is like a concatenation of strings, which allows you to do, check things like Merkle paths and deal with state. That's the extent of what I can explain about it, but it's very messy. I will say that the demo has already, settled a Stu Stark for a very simple statement. I think it's the Fibonacci sequence of like, 100 numbers or so. But it shows the path, yeah. And then, if we imagine that this will, no, so it's not that we said, we want to put it on Bitcoin, so we'll go to 32-bit field and so on. No. Since we founded Starkware 6 years ago, it always pained me immensely that we are burdened with working with large fields, because we knew that just over small fields, things will be extremely, much faster. But we did it because the main cost on Ethereum is basically verification, and verification costs the same for any integer size, and it was simpler to go with it. So that was the reason we moved now to smaller fields, and it happened to be a very fortunate coincidence that also helps us with Bitcoin.
Great, thank you.
So if GPUs go to if the GPU goes to 64-bit field, presumably you'll need a different prover. Is that going to make things better or worse?
I think over 60. Okay, it really depends how fast are your basic operations over the 64-bit field. If they are just as fast as 32-bit, I would guess that you probably are better off with a 64-bit field, just because, but I think it's unreasonable that 64 will be as fast as 32. But if it is, yeah, then maybe you want to go with 64.
Yeah.
How large are the proofs?
So the current proofs here at the current state are very large because we're not optimizing right now. Well, when I mean very large, I would say, let's say 100 kilobytes. But right now, so we're optimizing right now for performance, and there are all these parameters that we can tweak. For instance, the blow-up factor, stuff like that. Right now, we're not dealing with that yet. But you could, I would say that you can parameterize it to be, at the worst case, it would be, let's say, 200 kilobytes. If you work really, really, really hard, which means the prover will run a lot more time, you can probably make them be as small as, let's say, 20 to 40 kilobytes, but the prover will run a lot. And then you can, of course, sandwich. I mean, at the bottom of the layer, you could use like these large proofs and then recursively prove them. At the very end, you're going to use some very small proof. This is going to be highly relevant with respect to Bitcoin, because with Bitcoin, not only do you want to put extremely small proofs, you also want to use an interactive Stark. You don't want to use it like in a snark mode, a one-shot thing. You get 80 bits of grinding per block of Bitcoin, and you can use those 80 bits of grinding in order to use a smaller number of queries and reduce the cost. So, every setting will be different. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one. I'm thinking about how this sort of proof system design space changes as we shift targets from CPU to GPU. In listening to Daniel's talk yesterday, he described M31 as the end game for CPU-based provers. And I'm hearing from you that Circle Starks are fast on both CPU and GPU, but I'm curious, I guess, both is it clear that Circle Starks are actually better for GPU-based provers? And also, do you have a particular focus between, are you optimizing your design for CPUs or GPUs when it comes to conflicts between the two?
I don't know I'll say in what senses do I not know the answer yet. First of all, we just started exploring the GPU aspect of it. I'm not a sufficient expert on GPU hardware to say where it would lead. I do know that, again, just because the GPUs don't support binary field operations, then probably you want to use, prime fields. Now, whether M31 with respect to, I heard from, I think, Jeremy Brussel and the RISC-0 team, that on GPUs, you don't get that much better. Baby Bear and M31 pretty much are the same on GPUs. I don't know if you get any savings. I would say that the design, okay, what I feel very confident about is that the design space for extremely, like for the fastest provers, it's going to be all focused on small fields. How small the fields are going to be, I don't know if it's going to be 32, smaller size, or maybe all the way up to 64 if the hardware supports it, but definitely it's going to be focused on the small field stuff. Now, what I'm much less confident about is, you know, what is the right mixture of GKRs and logups and lookups and the usage of air and what degrees. And then there's this huge parameter space, right? Are you optimizing for proof size or on which architecture? That I have, you know, we're just, but it's all going to be, in terms of the very performant Starks, it's all going to be a small field.
Yeah.
If you want very small proof size, you know, like 1K and below, you're still going to, we don't know how to do that unless you use like a pairing-based snark. So.
And you said the GPU numbers that you were talking about are like released online today, or? So
the Blake 2 thing is there, and there'll be a blog explaining the arithmetization next week. The GPU probably, Andrew, is the GPU, it's probably not released, right? No, the GPU is not released, so you'll have to trust us. Hopefully we'll get it released soon.
Thanks, Eli.
Amazing. All right. Very excellent talk. Thank you, Eli. This was fantastic. All right. Our last speaker of the day is Bin Yi, who's going to tell us about latticefold. Here, Bin Yi, it's here. Okay. Floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bin Yi. I'm a postdoc researcher at Stanford, and today I'll present latticefold, which is a new folding scheme that has wide applications, including ZKVM. This is a joint work with our unique Dan. Okay, so the talk today is about building a magic primitive called ZK snarks. What is ZK snark? Roughly, it's a primitive that allows you to convince the verifier that certain computations were done correctly. And usually this computation involves a public instance part and a secret witness. For example, you can use it to prove that you know the pre-image of some public hash, or you can use it to prove that you know the secret key of some public Ethereum address, so you are the earner. And you can do more than that. You can prove arbitrary NP relation. So in snark scheme, initially, given some NP relation represented as an arithmetic circuit C here, we will run some setup algorithm to generate some parameters for prover and verifier. Then the prover, whenever he gets a statement that he wants to prove, will run this proving algorithm to generate short proof. And then the verifier will check this proof against public instance part of these statements. And if it's valid, then she'll be convinced that the statement is true and prover knows the witness. Beyond typical property like completeness, soundness, knowledge soundness, or zero knowledge, there's one unique feature of snark that makes it so useful, called succinctness. That means even if this arithmetic circuit is so expensive to evaluate, this proof should still remain really short and very cheap to verify. This kind of asymmetry makes it very useful in many applications, including scaling blockchain. So in a traditional blockchain, there are many blockchain nodes that will maintain some global blockchain state. And in each round, after some consensus algorithm, they will agree upon a block transactions to be executed later. And then now everyone needs to execute it and run the computation and obtain the global blockchain state. That definitely leads to a lot of redundant computation and execution, which makes blockchain less scalable and performant. However, suppose we have a really efficient ZK snark. Let's see what can happen. At a very high level, the idea is to let the prover to do the execution and attach and publish a snark proof validating the correctness of this execution, and then everyone will receive this proof and the claimed update states. And now everyone only needs to verify this proof instead of rerunning the computation. And because of succinctness, verifying proof is much cheaper than rerunning computation, and this saves a lot of computations and also makes blockchain more scalable. But this raises a different question in that how does a prover who possibly use commodity laptop or desktop or server, how can it generate this proof really efficiently? The dream goal here, of course, is proving as fast as compute, but that's actually a challenging problem for which that there are a lot of companies trying to work on it. So to illustrate the issue here, let's consider a typical approach to solving this. The idea is to model this VM execution as a fixed arithmetic circuit that you should fix beforehand. So that means the number of transactions you can handle should also be fixed before you receive the block. Then in the online time, when the prover receives this online block of transactions, then he will execute this block of transactions to obtain the execution trace and transform it into the witness of these arithmetic circuits. And after that, after getting the entire witness, then he can pick his favorite SNARK algorithm like Stark or Plonk to generate the final proof. However, this framework has several limitations, mainly because that in these particular applications, this circuit can be gigantic for simulating, say, millions or even billions of instructions, because this block can be large in order to get really good scalability. And that means even generating this witness can be a bottleneck, can be really computationally intensive. And remember, you can't even start doing the proving unless you get entire witness. And second, moreover, the SNARK algorithm itself can also be more memory and computationally intensive to compute when the disproving instance becomes really gigantic, like billions of size or even tens of billion size, because it uses some algorithm like FFTs or multi-group exponentiations that is less memory efficient or computationally efficient when the instance size is really, really, really large. And finally, as I mentioned before, the circuit has to be fixed beforehand. So we really can't say that suppose in online time you receive, no matter whether you receive a really small block or really large block, you always have to pay the worst case scenario proving cost. So that's also bad. So given this, there's an alternative way to build a ZK-VM proof using the so-called incrementally verifiable computation. And at a very high level, the idea to split this execution of blocks of transactions into many, many small pieces or many, many iterative steps. And then in each iterative step, the prover will generate a SNARK proof for these particular statements, which checks two things. First, that the state transition at this particular step is done correctly. And second, he also needs to check that exists some good proof that validates the correctness of all the previous steps. And how to check it, you just run this SNARK verify inside this statement circuit. And suppose now you get a new proof that validates correctness of these new statements, then now this new proof can serve as a certificate validating the correctness for all the previous executions, including this particular step. And you can do this again and again, and finally the last proof will be able to validate the correctness for entire ZK-VM execution. The advantage of this kind of framework is that you can now pipeline the proving and the witness generation process. That means you only need to know a little bit about the entire witness in order to run the first several iterative proving process. And that's much better than before, where you have to get the entire witness first. And second, because each iterative statement now only needs to embed a single state transition or very few number of state transitions, the statements here that you want to prove can also be much smaller, so that the SNARK algorithm you run will also need less memory. Finally, if you use some other more sophisticated way to do recursion called proof carrying data, this can actually also be made very, very parallelization friendly. However, it also has trade-off and limitations. The limitations here is that you have to pay some extra cost for generating such a proof. That is, you have to prove some statements about SNARK verification, which is not existent before in this monolithic SNARK framework. And in practice, this is actually concretely expensive for simulating those pairing operations or group exponentiations or many Merkle path openings. So that's concretely not that efficient until very recently. And so the question is whether we can have an alternative way to build an IVC or PCD. The answer is definitely yes, and this was actually answered by other researchers like several years ago. Around 2020 and 2021, there are two research groups figured out that actually we can build an IVC or PCD without relying on SNARK, but purely from a weaker primitive called folding schemes, which makes use of another crypto primitive, which I would call homomorphic binding commitment. So let me start with recall what a homomorphic commitment is. So a commitment allows you to compress a really long message into a short string that's bound to this message, meaning that if you fix this commitment, it's hard for you to open in two different messages. And the second, it needs to satisfy this homomorphic property, meaning that the commitment to, for example, the addition of two messages is basically just the addition of the corresponding commitments to the separate messages. And this homomorphic property is quite useful because whenever you want to check some linear relation over this long and expensive message space, it suffices for you to just check the corresponding relations over the commitment space, which is usually much cheaper and simpler. And this is also the core insight on how to build an efficient folding scheme, which I now am ready to explain what it is. So intuitively, it very roughly is a primitive that allows you to compress multiple MP statements into a single one. Okay? Why is it useful? Suppose you want to prove, like I know the preimage of many, many hashes, and you want to have a separate proof for each of them. That's usually pretty like communication inefficient and less efficient. And instead, suppose you have folding scheme, you can compress multiple MP statements first into a single same-size folding statement and just generate a single proof of that, which is usually more efficient. Okay, now let me be a little bit more specific. Let our MP be some MP complete relation. In a folding scheme, usually what we do is that we will insert a homomorphic commitment to the witness inside the public instance and give you a committed MP relation, which further checks that this is the correct commitment to the witness. And now a folding scheme syntactically allows you to merge two instances with pair inside this relation. Actually, should be a relaxed relation, but now I will omit technicality here. You merge these two instances with pair in this relation into a new folded instance with pair in the same relation. And we will also output proof pi here that allows the verifier later to efficiently check that this folded instance is honestly derived from the two input instances. And the one thing to note here is that folding verifier does not have access to this long witness here. So usually they are very, very efficient. And it also needs to satisfy similar completeness and North-South property that's very similar to snark. But the key point here, the greatness about folding scheme here is that usually we have very, very efficient instantiation of folding scheme compared to those snark counterparts. For example, the folding proof is pretty much just the randomly combination of two witness vectors, which are which consist of field elements. And the folding verifier is even simpler, it's just a linear combination of two corresponding commitments, which is very, very simple compared to snark that, for example, you need to use pairing or something. So this is good, and even better, it was shown that we can actually construct IVC purely from folding scheme. And the idea is very similar to the previous recursive snark idea. Well, at each iterative steps, the folding prover will collect the two statements he got previously, which is one online statement in the previous step, and another one is accumulated statement that collect or merge all the statements that has been done before that. And then in this step, he'll fold these two statements into new accumulated statements that checks that, basically checking that all the statements were checking correctly before. And then in this step, he also generates a new online statement checking that state transition at this particular step is done correctly. But of course, you also need to check that the folding was done correctly. And how to check that? You run the folding verifier here. And then you get a new online statement for which in the next step you can fold again. And finally, you'll get a last folded statement, and IVC verifier will check this last folded statements, and if it's true, that implies all the DKVM execution was done correctly. The logic is very similar to recursive snark. The nice thing here about IVC from folding is that in each iterative step, we can instantiate in a much, much faster way. Why? Because you can see here, we have replaced this snark proving algorithm with this folding prover, which is much faster. And on the other hand, this recursive statement, or this statement we want to fold, is also much, much cheaper because we have replaced this snark verification gadget with this folding verification gadget, which is much smaller. So given this, I hope I convinced you that IVC from folding is very efficient, and this reduces to the next question on how to build a very efficient folding scheme. And the first question we need to answer here is, which kind of homomorphic commitment should we use inside it? And one typical way and approach is to use Peterson commitments, which is exactly the thing that used in the previous works. And in Peterson commitment schemes, The message is a message vector of length n, which consists of many scalar field elements. And the commitment is a multi-group exponentiation between this message and a vector of random base generators. And this is a group elements, or it can be represented as a elliptic curve point, represented as 2 base field elements over FQ. The thing here is that both FP and FQ is very, very large. And this is inherent because of the assumption that this relies on called discrete log, which needs this to be large in order to be secure. And however, this is, it has some efficiency issues here in the sense that when you do the committing, it has to perform a lot of expensive group exponentiations over this large field, which is quite expensive, which I think also the last talk, Ellie talked about this, that we should focus on small field arithmetics. And if you instantiate it and obtain the folding scheme with it, the folding verifier circuit now will consist of a few group exponentiation done over the base field and some hash and field operation done over the scalar field. That means this circuit needs to represent and support both FP and FQ operations. So unavoidably, you have to do some so-called field emulation. Means that those FP operations needs to be represented as arithmetic over FQ, and because you only have a circuit over FQ, or vice versa. But anyway, this kind of translation is also very, very expensive. Finally, this scheme is also vulnerable to quantum attack because of this famous Shor's algorithm that can break discrete log. Given this, we choose to use a different commitments called lattice commitments, lattice-based commitments, and we introduce the first folding scheme called lattice fold from these commitments. It has several nice features here. First, now it supports the use of really fast and small field arithmetics. For example, you can use 64-bit prime fields or 32-bit prime fields. And second, because the commitment scheme will have a really nice property here, where the message space and commitment space, they all lie in the same kind of algebra object called a polynomial ring. So everything is done over the single same field or same ring. There's no need to do non-native field emulation anymore in the folding verifier circuit. And this also makes the circuit concretely more efficient. And finally, this commitment schemes is based on this some lattice assumption that's believed to be quantum attack resistant. So we also obtain a plausibly post-quantum secure schemes. And finally, supports the use of some high-degree constraint system, which is very convenient to use in practice for represent complex computation using really efficient and succinct circuits. Okay, so that's our main result. And now let me start by reviewing these commitments we use called R-type binding commitments. Again, recall our goal is to compress a long message into a short string. And here, this short string is basically just the lambda ZQ elements, where lambda is some parameter related to security parameter, and Q is some small primes. And we do this by multiplying this message vector with some pseudo-randomly generated matrix A here, which is a matrix over ZQ that has dimension lambda by n. But you might notice here, we have very strange requirements here for the message space. Well, for every element of this vector, we have to make sure that it's always inside this really narrow range of minus beta and beta. Well, beta is these range-bound parameters. And turns out this is actually essential for obtaining the binding property from this lattice assumption. So it is really necessary to have that requirement. And beyond that, we also satisfy this homomorphic property given the linearity of matrix multiplication, which is pretty straightforward. However, again, you have to be careful because you always have to make sure that after these linear operations, this resulting integer vector should still be inside this message space of the commitment scheme. Otherwise, this commitment is no longer well defined. Okay, so at this point, the committing complexity is still not very efficient. It takes like lambda times n small field operations. But we can do much better by using a variant of it. And here we'll introduce a new object called polynomial rings, or RQ. Roughly, it's the set of polynomials that has degree less than d and with ZQ coefficients and modulo some polynomial like x to the d plus 1. And now the idea here is very, very simple and it's very similar to before. Well, the only change here is that we'll view this previous scheme in a slightly different way. The idea is that we'll view every vector of DZQ elements just as the coefficients of some single polynomial ring elements. And that will translate to this. Well, W becomes W tilde, IA becomes L tilde, and CW becomes CW tilde. And now the key difference here is that when we commit, instead of performing matrix multiplication over ZQ, we just make matrix multiplication over RQ. And because we have a really efficient polynomial multiplication algorithm using NTT, this actually leads to much more efficient algorithms. For example, if you set this degree D to be exactly lambda, then L tilde basically now just a vector of n by d, and it's just an inner product. And that's the inner product is just n by d ring operations, and that will translate to approximately n log lambda small field operations, which is very, very efficient and also parallelization friendly. A great thing here is that actually there are many, many software and hardware optimizations for it in the fully homomorphic encryption setting and lattice signature scenarios, which makes it actually blazingly fast. Okay, so now I'm ready to go back to our main task for constructing a folding scheme from R-type commitments. For simplicity, I'll consider an even simpler problem. Well, the public instance only consists of these homomorphic commitments. And our goal here now is to merge these two commitment witness pairs into a single one. And the naive idea is to do random linear combination, which is exactly the way that has been used in all the previous existing works. However, in this scenario, we immediately run into trouble, because after folding, this folded witness will no longer be inside the message space of the commitments. And that's a big issue. And it's not an issue only because this random scalar is large, so that the norm will blow up. It's still an issue even if you just add the two witnesses together, because it's possible that initially those two witnesses might already approach the edge of this narrow space, and if you add them, it's very easy to go outside. And if you go outside, then it's bad, because the binding property no longer holds, and actually folding scheme will also no longer be secure. And we have some concrete attacks for that. So we face a real challenge here in that how can we keep this folded witness always stay in this bounded massive space of commitments, even after so many, many folding steps. And this is essential for the security of folding scheme. We solved this issue using two techniques. The first technique is called decomposition trick, but put it another way, another understanding of it is to try to re-represent and think about this input witness in a slightly different way. So let me be more specific and explain what decomposition works. Say you have a single integer that's inside this range of minus beta and beta, and our idea is to run some algorithm, some deterministic algorithm that's very similar to a bit decomposition algorithm to split its multiple integers that now have even smaller range. And these multiple integers here, A1 to AK, they are also can be understood as a different representation of A here, right? The binary representation, for example. And the great thing here is that every integer now is having even lower norms. And actually, we can extend this idea to the ring case or polynomial ring case. Well, what we do is just we split the coefficients separately using these algorithms. And now let's see why it's useful for us to do folding. Suppose we have two input witness pairs initially, and we run this deterministic algorithm to split them up into, say, for example, 4 instances with pair, where each intermediate instance with pair now is even in an even lower range, basically minus b and b here. And at this point, now it's suddenly, magically, now we can do random combination. But you need to be a little bit careful in that these random challenges still needs to be inside, have very, very small coefficients. And with that, with some careful choice of parameters, finally, you can guarantee that after folding, the folded witness will always be inside this massive space of commitments, because B is smaller than beta. Even if you have some blow up, you can control it to be inside this beta. But this solves our previous issue, but this raises a different question, however. And another issue here is, remember, the verifier also need to check that prover is not cheating, right? What if prover is using some bad intermediate witness that's slightly larger than minus B and B and still pass the check? Also, we need to make sure this folding verifier is efficient. So we cannot afford to send all this intermediate witness to verifier and let it to check it because it's very expensive. So that means we really need a folding prover to convince the verifier using a range proof to check, to convince the verifier that indeed I'm not cheating, I'm indeed using low norm witness in this intermediate step. And we achieve this by introducing a new novel range proof techniques from the sum check techniques. And for time reason, I won't dig really deep into these technical details, but the key point here is that both the proving time and verifier complexity is very, very efficient. The proof time is linear, and the verifier complexity is still logarithmic. Okay, so finally, I want to highlight the concrete efficiency of the scheme a little bit and compare to the state of the art. Also, we know that recently after we published this paper, there's a concurrent work which built a folding scheme purely from hashing, which is also a very elegant scheme, and they also have really efficient prover. And for lattice fold, our prover is also very efficient. It's approximately just a linear number of small field operations, which is it's much better than Peterson-based scheme that involves a lot of multi-group exponentiations over really large fields. And in terms of verifier circuit, it's also very competitive. The dominant cause is some sum checker verifier that takes logarithmic number of hashes. And the one thing to note here is that we don't need hash to be fast outside the circuit. We can use arbitrary snark-friendly hash because in our schemes, the prover doesn't perform too many hash operations. So concretely, we can make the verifier circuit very, very efficient compared to hash-based folding schemes. And it's also competitive to these Peterson-based schemes because we have fully eliminated the non-native field emulations. Finally, I want to mention two advantages of using lattice fold over this hash-based folding scheme. The first is that lattice fold allows you to fold for an unbounded constant number of steps. Well, in hash-based folding scheme, you have to fix some constant beforehand, and if you fold for more than that number of steps, there will be a concrete attack that breaks the security of the scheme. And finally, suppose you are using some applications that involve some sparse witness, meaning that the number of non-zero entries is really small, which is the case for some non-uniform computation or branch program executions. Then it's really advantageous to use lattice fold because the committing complexity is only proportional to the number of non-zero entries, and you don't need to do anything about those zero entries, which is not the case for the hash-based proofing system because it needs to perform some Merkle tree commitments that is always the same cost no matter whether it's zero or not. Okay, so I think that's all I want to cover. And in summary, we have introduced lattice fold, which is the first lattice-based folding scheme that supports really fast and small field arithmetics, have efficient verifier circuit because it eliminates non-native field emulations, and it is also plausibly quantum secure. We also want to highlight that in our recent updated version of paper, we have introduced another optimized folding scheme for high-degree constraint systems that is like now almost 50% more efficient than the previous one. And now there's only one sum checks, and both the prover time and the verifier complexity are also significantly improved. Okay, so that's it. And basically, I want to mention a little bit about open problem here. There are many, but I only will mention a few of them. The first low-hanging fruits, I think, here is to integrate it with Lasso to support table lookups, which I think won't to be too hard. However, an even long-term and more ambitious goal is to check whether we can actually remove the use of this witness decomposition or range proof checks that might even further improve the efficiency of lattice fold and kind of approaching our dream goal of proving as fast as compute. Okay, that's it, and thank you so much.
Terrific. Thanks for the wonderful talk. And we have a little bit of time for questions. Yeah, Aline, go ahead.
Hey, thanks for the talk. Really complicated math, could only follow a little bit of it, but I saw that you mentioned sum check-based range proofs. And this was something I once thought about and wondered if we could get a more efficiently batchable range proof from sum check. Does your range proof have nice batching properties?
Yes. Yes, exactly. One of the great features of our range proofs is exactly very good for batching. For example, here you have multiple instances with pairs, right? You have to approve the range for each of them. And actually, you only need to run one single sum check for all of them. So it's really good for batching.
And I suppose your range proof is for iTie hashes, but it could probably be generalized to Peterson commitments, no?
Yes, I think so. And I think at some follow-up work, there are indeed some paper that try to do range proofs for Peterson-based commitments. So I think this should be extendable. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, would love to talk to you about it. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? All right. In that case, let's thank Bini one more time. Thank you. All right. This brings us to the end of the first day. And as we said, there's a reception outside. And before you go home tonight, you have to think of a lightning talk that you can present tomorrow before lunch for 2 to 3 minutes. Okay. We'll see you tomorrow.